On October 13th, 2023, Microsoft would complete its acquisition of Activision Blizzard King, following a monumental transaction totaling $68.7 billion. Not only was this the largest transaction deal in video game acquisition history, but it also meant that Microsoft gained access to some of the biggest franchises to ever exist. Juggernauts like Call of Duty, Diablo, World of Warcraft, and even your parents' favorite Candy Crush were set to bolster the already ridiculous lineup of franchises that Microsoft had been building for decades. While this deal was certainly the biggest, it certainly wasn't the first. It's become somewhat of a running joke that Microsoft doesn't actually develop any of the games themselves, and instead buys other companies that will do the hard work for them. And while that's not entirely accurate, their track record would suggest otherwise. On March 9th, 2021, Microsoft would complete its acquisition of ZeniMax Media, the holding company in charge of publisher Bethesda Softworks, as well as the many developmental units under their wing. With the completion of this deal, Microsoft acquired the rights to a bounty of beloved franchises, ranging from Bethesda's ambitious yet monumental Fallout series to trailblazer franchises in Doom, Quake, and Wolfenstein from ID Software and Machine Games. Again though, this wasn't the first time they had done something like this. On November 10th, 2018, Microsoft would scoop up both In Exile Entertainment and Obsidian Entertainment, granting them access to franchises like Wasteland and Pillars of Eternity. Merely a few years before this, on November 6th, 2014, Microsoft would complete yet another acquisition, this time of Swedish video game developer Mojang Studios. I'm sure I don't even need to mention the franchise that came along with it. Even if we were to go back another whole decade past this, we'd see that Microsoft had already acquired both Rare and Bungie, along with their fresh but prized franchises. Now if I were to list off all the acquisitions of Microsoft, we'd be here all day. But just know that over the course of the last 2 or 3 decades, Microsoft has managed to build up a division that now owns a staggering number of developmental studios, with each one working on their own separate franchises. Now you're probably scratching your head and thinking, how is it possible that one company can hold so many franchises? And while there's a very simple answer to that question, money, we haven't even scratched the surface of Microsoft's seemingly endless library. Not to worry though, as in this absolutely insane video, we will be going through each and every franchise now owned by Microsoft, in an attempt to find out the current state that they're in. As with all the videos in this series, I will be placing each of them into a tier list, with each tier representing a separate state. For franchises to be considered for this list, they must have been released in the West at some point, and have at least 2 games to their name. With that being said, let's see just how effective all that money is, as we dive into one of the largest and most lucrative gaming companies to ever exist. To start, we have to go back to 1977, and while Microsoft itself was formed barely 2 years before this, the company we're interested in is Infocom, a small American software company formed by MIT alumni and staff members. Among them were Tim Anderson, Mark Blank, Dave Lebling, and Bruce Daniels. These 4 in particular would go on to develop a text-based adventure game later known as Zork. Taking much of its inspiration from Colossal Cave Adventure, Zork had players exploring an underground empire in search of treasure. It was one of the very first interactive adventure games, allowing players to make their own decisions and craft their very own story within reason. The use of commands that players would type themselves was pivotal in making this interactive element a reality, and the program responded in turn, narrating the surrounding environments and situations. As I'm sure you can imagine, this was remarkable for the time, so much so that the games proved to be extremely popular, with the final product splitting off into 3 separate chapters, with each one selling hundreds of thousands of copies. Noticing this monumental success, Activision, a newly established video game publisher made up of Atari veterans, would look to buy Infocom in 1986. Under Activision's watch, Infocom would continue to pump out games, with each one taking on the Zork name in some way. Over the years though, the profit margins for each of these games would dwindle to the point where Activision had no choice but to terminate the division in 1989. Even so, the Zork franchise continued to live on, and we even saw a few graphical releases in the 90s, with games like Return to Zork in 1993 and Zork Grand Inquisitor in 1997. Unfortunately, following these particular releases, Activision shifted its focus away from the franchise, and while there have been attempts at reviving the series, most commonly from independent sources like the freemium browser-based game Legends of Zork in 2009, none have successfully done so. While it takes the first slot among the dead franchises, no one can deny its lasting impact not only on the adventure game genre, but on the gaming industry as a whole. This impact was felt almost immediately, with numerous software companies looking to develop their own adventure games. One such company was Sierra Entertainment, a small video game developer founded in 1979 by husband and wife duo Ken and Roberta Williams. Despite enjoying the text-based best adventures before them. Roberta Williams in particular believed the genre could be enhanced with the introduction of graphical art. Fortunately enough, the Apple II had the capacity to display these images, and by the end of 1980, Roberta had designed and released both Mystery House, and more specifically, The Wizard and the Princess. Not only were these the first adventure games to feature graphics, but the story and setting of The Wizard and the Princess would be expanded upon 4 years later, in 1984, with the release of King's Quest I, Quest for the Crown. Like its predecessors, the game has players type in commands, which are then acted upon in the game. Unlike its predecessors though, this game introduced graphical animation into its gameplay. This allowed for more depth perception in which the player character could hide behind objects as well as interact with items and doors in a way that had never been seen before. The success of this particular game led to the expansion of an entire franchise, with numerous games releasing year after year until 1998 with King's Quest VIII, Mask of Eternity, marking the first instance in which the series entered the 3D landscape. During that same year, the company would be caught in an accounting scandal, forcing many of its founders to leave. The aftermath of this incident also meant that the King's Quest franchise entered a dormant state, with little hope for the future. Over the next decade, Sierra's parent company would be acquired by Vivendi Games, before ultimately being purchased by Activision. Activision would then revive the Sierra brand in a last-ditch effort to market some of the older franchises, King's Quest being one of them. The resulting product would be released in 2015, simply titled King's Quest: The Complete Collection. The game was marketed as a reimagining instead of a remake, with the game shedding its point-and-click origins and now allowing players complete control over the movements of Graham. The game would culminate in 5 chapters, as well as an epilogue that would be released periodically over the next year, ending in 2016. Despite the game and, in particular, the earlier chapters receiving a lot of praise for their fresh new perspective on an old tale, the franchise is yet to see any new releases. Following Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard, there may be some hope for a new entry in the distant future, but for now, it's most likely a zombie franchise. Each new year would bring about a new take on the adventure genre, this time taking the form of a stealth-like action game titled Castle Wolfenstein. Players would assume the role of a prisoner who had escaped his cell after being captured during World War II. The idea then was to escape the whole prison facility by either sneaking past enemies or dispatching them. The castle setting was procedurally generated, with each room potentially containing enemies or even chests. Now, despite the series' early and influential take on stealth-like gameplay, the Wolfenstein franchise wouldn't exactly flourish until its 1992 release, titled Wolfenstein 3D. As the name suggests, this was the series' first leap into the 3D landscape, as well as the first one to adopt the standard first-person perspective. Its use of gore and violence paired with its fast-paced action made for an addictive experience and one that was praised almost universally by critics and players alike. Its legacy carries on to this day, with many considering it to be one of the most influential games with regards to popularizing the first-person shooter format, and its popularity gave birth to a whole new lineup of games that have been released consistently up until 2019, with Wolfenstein Youngblood and Wolfenstein Cyberplot. Yep, I mean, these games weren't very good, and despite the story being left up in the air, many started speculating that the series had reached its end following the poor reviews of the last 2 games. There is some hope, however, as back in 2018, Pete Hines stated that they were absolutely going to make a Wolfenstein 3, and even though Machine Games was taking a detour with Youngblood, they knew everyone wanted to see the end to the original storyline. That being said, there haven't been any new updates regarding the franchise since. For now, I think it can just barely sit in the "it exists" here. Speaking of detours though, we can finally branch out from graphic adventure games to one of the first platformer games in Pitfall. All things considered, this was a very simple game. You'd get 20 minutes to see how far into the jungle landscape you could explore as you dodged barrels, swung across vines, and leapt across, well, pitfalls. Despite its simplicity, the game would go on to become one of the most influential platformers as well as one of the best-selling games on the Atari 2600. In an attempt to capitalize on this unexpected success, Activision would produce numerous sequels, from Pitfall 2, Lost Caverns in 1994, all the way up to Pitfall: The Lost Expedition, which was released back in 2004. By this point, however, the idea and series had gotten dull, resulting in no new releases for the franchise. The series would see one last spike in 2012 when Activision's UK-based studio, The Blast Furnace, developed and released Pitfall for the iOS. While it tried to mimic the gameplay of the popular game Temple Run, it fell short in terms of player count and downloads and has since been taken off the App Store. Series creator David Crane would then attempt to start a Kickstarter in hopes of developing a spiritual successor to the Pitfall series. Unfortunately, the funding received wasn't nearly enough to warrant the development of this new series though. This does mean that we have to place the Pitfall franchise into the dead tier. Well, this is unexpected. I had initially thought that it'd take a while to arrive at a franchise that was actually developed by Microsoft themselves, but I guess I'm gonna have to put some respect on their names. Then again, I'm sure there are people out there who would argue this isn't technically a game.
What the hell is even that?
Now, considering it was initially developed as a definitive game that would help showcase the difference between 8-bit computers and the new 16-bit computers, I'd say those arguing against it would be at quite a disadvantage. For those of you that are just listening or are drunk, yes, this is Microsoft's Flight Simulator, or Flight Simulator 1.0 to be exact. This number would change with each new edition as new aircraft, locations and modes were added. There's a good chance that many of you played an iteration of Flight Simulator when you were growing up. For those of us that were lucky enough to have our own joystick attachment, this was as close as we got to experiencing life as a pilot. Despite the games having little to no objective in place, they would go on to sell extremely well, pushing Microsoft to release 10 iterations of the game before the 2000s were even upon us. By this point, however, the gaming landscape had completely shifted, and a flight simulator, while cool, wasn't going to beat out all the new shooter and action games on display. Following the closure of Ace's game studio, the series would release fewer and fewer games, with the most recent one taking us back to 2020. With all that being said, the series is still going strong to this day, with a new entry already confirmed for a 2024 release. With a new career-style missions mode, aerial firefighting, and search and rescue events, it seems Microsoft is putting a lot into this game, and it gives me hope for the continuation of the franchise. For now though, I'd still place it within the "it exists" tier. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for this next franchise. Before coming to be known as Rare, British video game developer Ultimate Play the Game would release Sabre Wulf, an action-adventure game in which players took control of Sabreman as he explored his way through a maze hidden in a jungle. Players would need to navigate Sabreman through a seemingly endless maze as they tried to find 4 amulet pieces, which would grant them access past the titular guardian at its exit. Interestingly, the game provided absolutely no hand-holding or guidance when it came to playing the game. This meant that players would have to engage in some trial and error if they wanted to have any chance of finishing this. Thankfully for fans of the series, Ultimate Play the Game had already developed its 2 sequels, which were released in quick succession of one another in the following years. Night Law in particular was especially influential as it introduced a new technique called filmation that allowed objects to pass over and behind each other without colliding. This gave a perception of depth to the game which was unheard of at the time. Each new iteration of Sabreman would top the last in terms of popularity. I mean, with all things considered, it seemed like Sabreman was on its way to becoming a household franchise in gaming history. 1986 saw the release of the 4th entry, Pentagram, and it's here where things start to drop off. Underworld, which was the second game in the franchise, featured 3 exits, with each leading to the continuation of its events in another game. One exit led to the aforementioned Night Law, another led to Pentagram, and the final one led to Maya Mare. Now, Maya Mare would never be completed, with Rare themselves stating that due to their tight schedule, they never got around to finishing the coding for the game. So that's it, I guess. Well, not quite. In 2004, the franchise would get one last lifeline when a remake of the first game would see the light of day. Seeing as it's a remake, the gameplay didn't exactly mimic that of its 1984 counterpart. Sabre Wulf on the Game Boy Advance was more of a platformer, where players would once again control Sabreman as he looked to steal treasures while avoiding the Guardian Sabre Wulf. The game did end up receiving positive reviews, but unfortunately these reviews didn't help bolster its humble sales numbers. The franchise has been dormant since then and is most likely a dead one. We now come to one of the most inconsistent franchises based on release schedules. The Bard's Tale games are a series of dungeon crawlers, with the first one dating back to 1985. The objective of these games was simple enough: work your way through maze-like dungeons while slaying monsters, finding treasure, and gaining experience to become more powerful. The Bard himself also had an important role in these games, as the songs would imbue the party with significant buffs like increased armor or faster attacks. The original Bard's Tale would go on to sell over 407,000 units, becoming the best-selling RPG series of the 1980s, and being one of the few that could compete with the dominant Ultima series at the time. 2 sequels would quickly follow, as well as a construction set that allowed players to create their own little dungeon crawlers if they so wished. Following the construction set, the franchise would seemingly go into hibernation, with neither Interplay Productions nor EA expressing any desire to continue the popular dungeon crawler. This silence would last until the early 2000s, with Brian Fargo leaving Interplay to start his own company known as In Exile Entertainment. From here, he would release a game titled The Bard's Tale in 2004, and while it didn't have any relation to the previous trilogy due to EA still holding the rights, it did give some hope of the series continuing. Again, these dreams were short-lived, as another decade passed without any news. Once again though, the holy saviour Brian Fargo would bless fans with some good news in 2015, as he announced his plans to develop a true sequel to the original trilogy. A Kickstarter campaign was launched in hopes of gathering the required funds, and as you can probably tell, the goal was reached. And for the first time in over 2 decades, a true sequel that continued the story of the original trilogy finally made its way out. The Bard's Tale 4, Barrow's Keep, kept to its traditional dungeon crawler roots, but this time switched things up with its first-person perspective. The series would also see a few spin-offs in the form of a remastered trilogy, as well as a voice-driven game developed for phones. With regards to news surrounding a potential Bard's Tale 5, I'm afraid there isn't anything at this point that would suggest that it's in the works or even being considered. With that in mind, I think this franchise may be falling into the live support tier. For now though, it can sit in the it exists tier. Now, something you may have noticed with regards to the franchise covered so far was their reluctance to move away from the medieval setting that had been popularized by previous games. Space Quest looked to rectify this, not only taking place in, well, space, but also trading out the often serious and cryptic undertones for a more light-hearted and comedic adventure. Throughout the series of 6 games, players would travel the cosmos as Roger Wilco, a janitor whose sole purpose for his adventures was to see really clean floors. While its theming may have differed from other graphic adventure series, its gameplay mimicked them to a T. Players would still be required to type in commands in order to solve puzzles and move between spaceships. The immediate success of the first game would result in a further 5 sequels being made for the series up until 1995 with Space Quest 6. By the end of 1996, the series had been stated to have sold over 1.2 million copies, a very respectable number considering the series was first conceived to be a fun, silly game that relied heavily on its humour. Despite its meaningful sales, Space Quest 6 remains the last entry in the franchise to this day, meaning we can slot it into the dead tier. Sierra Online was on fire during the 80s, and barely a year after releasing Space Quest, they would be back in the market with Police Quest. They really liked slapping Quest at the end of all their series, didn't they? Naming conventions aside, these games, despite appearing as your typical graphical adventure games, were designed with the intention of being police simulation games. Unlike Microsoft's Flight Simulator though, Police Quest looked to combine the command line interface of their previous titles with strict adherence to police protocol. As a result, the game offered fewer puzzles than previous titles and was more focused on making sure you stayed in line with the duties of a police officer. In some ways, this limited player choice, but it also provided a good learning experience for those interested in the profession. The commercial success of the original would lead to the production of multiple sequels, some of which would take on the name of SWAT. By the 2000s, this was the dominant naming convention of the series, with the gameplay fully switching to a first-person shooter perspective. While these were popular in their own right, the overwhelming competition that was birthed in the early 2000s around first-person shooters ultimately drowned out the SWAT games, and following SWAT Elite Troops in 2008, the series would seemingly end forever. During this period, the gaming market was dominated by countless adventure games, platformers, or fantasy-based RPGs. Interplay Productions, on the other hand, wanted to create something fresh. They looked to create a post-apocalyptic world that had been destroyed by a nuclear holocaust. The game incorporated many aspects of your typical tabletop RPGs and allowed the player to assign points to a multitude of different attributes. Now, I'm sure this is all sounding extremely familiar, but the game I'm talking about isn't Fallout. No. This was a series that would come to be known as Wasteland, and it served as an inspiration point for Fallout. Alongside its unique setting and customary RPG elements, it was also one of the first games to ever feature a persistent world. This meant that if you were to leave a certain part of the world in one state, it would remain that way upon your return, no matter how long it had been. The original Wasteland would sell decently well, shipping over 250,000 units upon its release. This would lead to the production of 2 further sequels, both of which took their sweet ass time to release, with Wasteland 2 coming after a staggering 26 years, and Wasteland 3 following up shortly after in 2020. This is honestly good news though, and places the franchise in a decent spot going forward. And while series developer In Exile Entertainment seems to be preoccupied with a new game in Clockwork Revolution, there's a good chance we'll end up seeing a Wasteland 4 sometime in the future. The 1980s were a turbulent time for game developers, with many banking on that miracle, that dream that one day one of their games would explode in popularity, gaining them the recognition they so craved. One of the most notable prospects was a company called Rare, and while they're well known these days for their unique and charming games, this wasn't always the case. And had it not been for this next franchise, there may have been a future in which Rare didn't exist as it does today. The franchise in question is RC Pro-Am, a racing game that incorporates vehicular combat to give everyone a fair shot at winning each race. I should note that this was years before Mario Kart and F-Zero, so the idea that you could gather power-ups and destroy your opponents was somewhat novel at the time. As simple as it sounds by these standards, the game would go on to receive universal acclaim, selling over 2.3 million copies and solidifying Rare as a top-notch game developer. Rare would follow up Pro-Am with 2 sequels, which were released in the following years. Unfortunately though, these sequels, while praised for their additions of multiplayer, additional tracks and items, and vehicle upgrades, didn't switch up the gameplay nearly enough to reach the same peaks as their predecessors. The series would end off with RC Pro-Am 2 in 1992, marking it as yet another dead franchise. I probably don't even need to mention who created this next lineup of games. I'll give you a hint though. The title reads Quest for Glory. Yep, we're back with Sierra Online, and in typical Sierra fashion, Quest for Glory took on the role of an adventure game that also incorporated RPG elements. In fact, these games were practically the culmination of all Sierra's past games. It mixed the puzzle elements from King's Quest with the humour and puns of Space Quest to create a story-driven narrative with memorable and fun characters. The series would include 5 games, with each one continuing where the last one left off. The Quest for Glory series also introduced a revolutionary method in which players could import their characters from one game to the next, allowing for an almost seamless story to be told across the whole franchise. The series as a whole is often considered to be ahead of its time, often incorporating features like a day and night cycle or NPCs that follow a specific schedule in the background. While commonplace these days, mechanics like this were almost unheard of during their releases. Despite its innovative and unique additions to the adventure and RPG genres, the series wouldn't make it out of the 20th century, ending with Quest for Glory 5 Dragonfire in 1998. Now, despite the Quest for Glory franchise being a dead one, its soul does live on. In 2012, co-creators Corey and Laurie Cole started a Kickstarter crowdfunding campaign to help finance a game called Hero U, Road to Redemption. In 2018, after 6 long years of development, the game would be released, and while it may not carry the same name, everything that made the original Quest for Glory series special was also here. The game, while rooted in its RPG elements, still offered a vast array of experiences, with mysteries to be solved, NPCs to be befriended, romance, and of course, plenty of humour and puns to go along with it. Again, the original franchise will remain dead, I believe, but it's nice to see that the series creators are still having a lot of fun developing some kick-ass games. Now, while we're on the topic of mysteries, we can't forget about Sierra's next franchise, Laura Bow. Honestly, the biggest mystery is how Sierra managed to release so many games in such a short time frame, but I digress. The Laura Bow series was a set of adventure games that focused on intrigue and mystery. The games as such included a lot of inventory-based puzzles, detective work, and plenty of interactions that require interrogating others. The 2 games would be released over the course of 3 years, with numerous collections being re-released in the following decades. I believe these games were always meant to be a pair of games and nothing more, so it isn't strange to think of them as a dead or finished franchise in this regard. The next franchise to come out went by the name of Commander Keen. These were a series of side-scrolling platformers that had players defending Earth from a dangerous collection of alien threats. Being that it was a platformer, players could jump over enemies with their surprisingly springy shoes or blast them to death with their ray gun. The game also incorporated their own little world map the players would venture through to reach each level. The series would expand to include a further 4 games, with each one adding on new items or changing up how platforms moved. Despite gaining a rather small following, the franchise would end in 2001 with the release of Commander Keen on the Game Boy Color. Since then, there have been a few attempts at reviving this franchise. Most notably in 2013, series creator Tom Hall would start working on a developmental tool for platformer games dubbed Worlds of Wonder. A Kickstarter was created in order to fund both the production of this tool as well as a game titled Secret Spaceship Club. Tom Hall described this game as being a spiritual successor to the Commander Keen series, and had the game kicked off successfully, there may have been a world in which the Commander Keen franchise lived. Alas, I doubt it has much of a chance now. Now, in case you ever had the urge to beat up some mutant aliens as a warrior toad named after a skin condition, Rare had you covered with their release of Battletoads. Now, for me personally, these games aren't exactly beat 'em ups. They're more like getting beaten up because they're fucking hard. The variety on display in these games is honestly astounding. From the enemy types you'll be facing, to the hazards and obstacles you'll need to avoid, almost every level brings something new to the table. This keeps things interesting for sure, but also adds to the difficulty as players would never be able to acclimate to the rapidly shifting gameplay mechanics. The game was initially developed as a means of combating the profitable TMNT series, and I have to say that this strategy couldn't have worked out better. Despite its immense difficulty, the game would garner critical acclaim upon its release, while gaining a sort of cult following. This success led to the production of a few sequels, some of which had crossover appearances with other popular beat-em-up series like Double Dragon. For whatever reason, this influx of games only lasted a few years, and by the 2000s the franchise was long considered forgotten. Throughout the following decades, you'd have people and even companies begging for a revival or reboot of the series, and after 25 years of waiting, all this praying and begging would eventually pay off, when Battletoads, a reboot of the series, was released in 2020. Now featuring couch co-op, the game played just like the originals, but seemed to lack that same difficulty that came with the platforming segments of earlier releases. The game would be met with average reviews, and with no information regarding its sales numbers, it's hard to say whether this release convinced Xbox to keep the series afloat. For now though, it's not looking too promising. If I were to say the words silicon and synapse, I wonder just how many bells that'd ring. Now upon hearing those words, there's probably a group of you that know where I'm going with this, and another that thinks I'm completely off my pills. See, Silicon and Synapse were the developers of this next franchise, the Lost Vikings, and while this franchise in particular has been been lost to time, its initial success would lead to the birth of one of the most recognized establishments in the gaming space. We'll get to that eventually though. The Lost Vikings was a game that had a very clever take on the puzzle format. As the player, you were tasked with guiding 3 Vikings through a set of bizarre levels. Each Viking would have a set of attributes that were unique to them, and it was up to the player to use these abilities to work their way around each level. These levels were specifically designed in a way that required each Viking to be used in a specific way, and the only way to beat our level was to guide all 3 of them to the exit. Despite being one of Silicon and Synapse's earliest games, the Lost Vikings would prove to be commercially successful. This would lead to the release of a sequel in 1997, fittingly titled The Lost Vikings 2. The sequel would play in the same manner as its predecessors, while adding in 2 more new Vikings with fresh abilities. The reoccurring Vikings also had a lot of their unique attributes updated or changed completely, resulting in a new experience for returning players. With that being said, Silicon and Synapse's focus would shift over the years, and as we'll see, there's really no place for the Lost Vikings franchise in that new vision. Now there comes a time in every game developer's life where they've been given a chance to create something special, with the hopes that it'll lead them to worldwide stardom, and in 1993, that chance fell to ID Software. Sure, they got a small taste of success with their Wolfenstein series, but even Wolfenstein would pale in comparison to what they had in store for us next. Many games have been called revolutionary over the years, many of which you could actually argue to some degree as to whether or not they actually are. Doom, on the other hand, is one of the very few where I'd assume the vast majority would refer to it as such without much kickback. It's one of those games where I probably don't even need to say anything, and everyone watching would still understand just how much of an impact this game had. When you've got people calling you the father of a whole genre, or one that caused a paradigm shift so big that even people who don't play video games would still be able to recognize the format you popularized and associate it with the term gaming, it's impossible to argue against its significance. An overnight success upon its release, Doom quickly expanded into a full-blown media franchise, with numerous sequels being released in the following years. Following a short period of dormancy, mainly due to staffing changes as a result of further complications with the development of Quake, Doom would get another entry that acted as a reboot titled Doom 3. Despite the game being a commercial success, selling over 3.5 million copies and becoming ID Software's most profitable game to date, the Doom franchise seemingly got engulfed by hell. Plans for a Doom 4 had been confirmed, only to be cancelled and restarted years later after the developers felt they had strayed too far from the series' origins. And thank God they made that decision, as after a few more excruciating years of waiting, another series reboot simply named Doom would release. Now I know I don't speak for everyone here, but the success of this game should go to show developers that gamers don't need any crazy changes or revolutionary gimmicks, especially when it's attached to such a beloved franchise. Just give us an improved, polished, and working game that incorporates the core features that made the classic so great, and I guarantee you the game will perform well. Doom is a perfect example of this. The gameplay was crisp, fast-paced and hectic, the graphics are sublime, and to my surprise they even added in new and improved finishes. This reboot, like many of the other mainline entries in the Doom franchise, was met with critical acclaim, and for the first time in decades it felt like the series was going back to being stable. 4 years later, we'd get another modern Doom release, in Doom Eternal, which once again had stellar level design, addictive action-based gameplay, and even some alright platforming sections, although they weren't really my favourites. The franchise as a whole has sold over 15 million units, and while that doesn't sound like a lot, I think the significance of this franchise and its somewhat consistent release schedule helps push it up into the mainstays. Now while ID Software was winning game awards left and right with Doom, there was one criteria that they had absolutely no chance of winning, that being the company with the most consistent release schedule. That award would go to Sierra Online, who is dominating the list so far, and it looks like they won't be stopping anytime soon, as in 1993 they would release another game titled Gabriel Knight. In typical Sierra fashion once again, Gabriel Knight was another interactive point-and-click adventure game where players would follow along with struggling author Gabriel Knight as he finds out that he's destined to become a shadow hunter. The story would take place over 3 games, each including voice acting for each of its characters. By the time the 3rd game was released, the series had transitioned to using 3D rendered graphics, creating an even more realistic feeling, almost as if you were part of the story being told. While the series would garner significant praise, mainly for its use of voice acting to tell the story, it was one of those series that didn't sell too well. Many attribute this to the shifting nature of the industry as a whole, with more games centered around fast action-packed gameplay, rather than slower, more methodical storytelling. I know we just went over how influential Doom was, but I guess this is just another example that goes to show just how game-changing that particular release was. Series creator Jane Jensen has gone on the record stating that she would love to create a fourth installment and has even pitched ideas for a new Gabriel Knight game to Activision and Vivendi over the years. Unfortunately, outside of a remaster that was released in 2014, the franchise has remained dormant, and due to the complex nature of IP rights, it isn't likely we'll see another entry anytime soon. The 1990s truly were the breakout point for so many established gaming companies. We've seen it with ID Software and Doom, and we'll continue to see it throughout this video. But for now, let's focus on a little company simply known as Bethesda Softworks. Throughout the 1980s, Bethesda had worked predominantly on sports games, releasing titles such as NCAA basketball and Wayne Gretzky's hockey. Coming into the 1990s, however, they began work on a game known as the Elder Scrolls Arena. As the name suggests, the game was initially going to be an action game where you fought against other teams in arenas around the world. As development continued though, this idea was dropped for a living world full of RPG elements, and before long the game had been fully converted into an RPG, with players being able to venture from town to town while fighting monsters and completing quests. One of the most impressive features of Arena was its expansive world, or should I say, infinite world. You can spend literal hours just wandering in the wilderness, where you'll find dungeons, inns, and other small secrets. It was also one of the first games to feature a realistic day and night cycle that affected NPCs' schedules and the opening and closing time of certain shops. The Elder Scrolls Arenas would go on to receive very positive reviews, and while the game wasn't considered a breakout success, it did do enough to spawn a sequel called The Elder Scrolls II: Daggerfall. Daggerfall, unlike its predecessor, was a commercial hit, selling over 700,000 copies by the year 2000. Its follow-up, Morrowind, would perform even better, as would Oblivion, the fourth entry in the franchise. This continued success would ultimately culminate in the release of The Elder Scrolls V: Skyrim, which not only became the best-selling game in the entire series, but has also found its name amongst other phenomenal titles as one of the best games ever created. The Elder Scrolls franchise is one of the few to release consistently stellar games, from the enchanting yet alien atmosphere and environments of Morrowind, to the enhancements in NPC AI that allowed for them to interact with the world in ways unimaginable at the time in Oblivion, to the variety of enemies and expansions to the game world in Skyrim. Each one of these games offered something that was unique, something that made that specific game shine. Say what you want about Bethesda these days, when it comes to the Elder Scrolls franchise, they truly did have that magical touch. Even the Elder Scrolls Online, which started off pretty rocky, has since recovered in a meaningful way. This brings us to the future of this franchise. While it's been over a decade since a mainline release, the sixth entry has in fact been confirmed, after it was announced at E3 2018, with sales figures closing in on 100 million. The Elder Scrolls franchise deserves a spot among the flagships. Front Page Sports Baseball was a series of baseball games created by Dynamix. These were your typical sports games that would release almost annually with updated players and gameplay modes. Outside of that, however, there isn't much to say about this one. The series would end off in the 1990s, making for another dead franchise. Now, if there was one genre that seemingly dominated the early 90s of the gaming industry, especially in arcades, it would without a doubt be the fighting game genre. Games like Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter II would erupt in arcades, becoming some of the highest grossing games in history. Rare, like any other company, would inevitably pick up on this trend, and in 1994 they released their own fighting game called Killer Instinct. In some ways this game was similar to others in its genre, but in many ways it wasn't. Instead of depleting one life bar to win a round, Killer Instinct had players deplete 2 whole life bars. This allowed for longer fights that weren't interrupted by the start of a new round, leading to a more seamless experience. The game also featured combo breakers, which let players counter long combo strings from their opponents. Now, I didn't know this personally, but back in their 2013 reboot of the series, they apparently introduced counter breakers as well, which you could mix into your combos on the off chance that should your opponent do a combo breaker, you'd be able to punish them with an even longer combo. I don't know why that's so funny to me. What's next? Combo counter breakers? Sorry, I'm getting a little sidetracked. The popularity of the original would spawn a sequel in 1996 called Killer Instinct 2. As the first did, the sequel would draw heavily from not only its predecessor but also other fighting games like Street Fighter Alpha's Super Bar and Mortal Kombat's Fatality finishes. I mentioned the reboot earlier, and that's where the franchise remains to this day. Now, despite the game releasing over a decade ago at this point, it brings me joy to know that the game is still getting developmental support from its developers. While a new game doesn't seem to be on the horizon just yet, there's still some support for the future of this franchise. Remember that Silicon and Synapse company that we were talking about earlier? Well, they're back, and this time under a new name. See, after the release of the Lost Vikings, Silicon and Synapse would change their name to Chaos Studios. From here, they would be acquired by Davidson's and Associates, before being contacted by a company called Chaos Technologies, who wanted them to pay $100,000 to keep their name. Not wanting to do this, it was decided that they'd start scouring the dictionary for a new one. They wanted it to be short yet interesting, but there were also some complications that required them to run each word through a legal team to make sure it didn't breach any other company's name. Eventually, they would stumble across a word that everyone seemed to like. That word was Blizzard, and by the end of 1994, the company would come to be known as Blizzard Entertainment. While all of this was happening, the team at Blizzard had been working on a new RTS game, one that took inspiration from games such as Dune 2 or Herzog's Way. The game would release towards the end of 1994, and almost as if fate willed it, this game would be the very same one that would put Blizzard on the map. The game in question was Warcraft, Orcs and Humans, and although it didn't bring any crazy innovations to the RTS table, its gameplay elements had been refined to such a point that it might as well have been confused for pure perfection. As you'd expect, the game sold extremely well, shipping over 300,000 units within its lifetime. This gave Blizzard the financial comfort to expand the franchise, and in doing so, it would boost their reputation from a mere prospect to a household name in the gaming industry. Both Warcraft 2 and 3 would improve upon their predecessors, with each selling incredibly well in the process. Warcraft 3 in particular added numerous additions, like a day and night cycle that obscured lines of sight, hostile creeps that guard key areas, and powerful units called heroes who each had a set of unique spells. By this point, the world of Warcraft was so massive and full of life that Blizzard would use it as a basis for many of their games to come, most notably the world-renowned World of Warcraft. As I'm sure everyone probably knows, World of Warcraft was a major critical and commercial success upon its original release, and quickly became one of the most popular MMORPGs of all time, if not the most popular. The game has grossed over $9 billion in revenue, with many citing it as one of the greatest MMORPGs of all time. Not only that, they've even branched out into card games with Hearthstone, and while not as big, has certainly built up its own significant following. The Warcraft franchise is without a doubt one of Microsoft's new flagship franchises. Now before you ask, no, Doom didn't get an expansion pass. This is in fact a completely different series, going by the name of Heretic. As you can probably tell, this game was built using the same exact engine as Doom, and as such, it plays in a similar manner to the aforementioned classic. The game did switch up a few things though, now allowing players to manipulate their inventory as well as move their cameras up and down. The popularity of the original would lead to the development of a further 3 games, a sort of mini spin-off series in the Hexen games as well as a direct sequel in Heretic 2. Ironically enough, despite the Hexen games being the indirect sequels, they played exactly like the original Heretic did, while Heretic 2, the direct sequel, went on to forge its own unique path. Hexen beyond Heretic would introduce character classes to the series, with each one coming equipped with unique weapons and character traits. This was also the first game in the series to incorporate hub zones that allowed levels to be interconnected through a central area. This would allow for larger, more elaborate puzzles to be developed, as players would be able to traverse from side dungeons to main levels in order to solve them. Hexen 2 would further expand on the franchise, introducing yet another 4 character classes as well as implementing destructible terrain and even abilities that can be acquired through leveling up. The series would end with Heretic 2, which was released in 1998. As I mentioned, this game branched out, now playing from a third person's perspective. While this didn't go down well with many of the fans of the original game, it did have a lot of benefits. By moving to the Quake 2 engine, it allowed for far more variety in the movement of Corvus. Unlike his stagnant self in the first few games, Corvus could now backflip, climb up ledges, and even pole vault. These movement capabilities had hardly been seen in the adventure game genre to this point, and the dark yet dynamic 3D environments quickly became a playground of possibilities. Now with all of that being said, the franchise would unfortunately end here, with Activision showing no signs of rebooting or reviving the franchise. Maybe I should have titled this video The Current State of Every Sierra Online Franchise, because they were seemingly everywhere during the 90s. Their next franchise would be Phantasmagoria, a series of point-and-click horror games that had their fair share of controversy attached to them. Phantasmagoria was just as much an interactive film as it was a game, as players followed Adriana Delaney as she was haunted by supernatural forces. The game drew attention for its live-action actors, cinematic footage, and use of violence and sexual content. All of this added to a sense of realism to the whole story being portrayed, and as I mentioned, it also got the game into its fair share of controversies. Thankfully, players didn't give a fuck about the controversy, and the game quickly soared to the top of the sales charts, becoming Sierra's best-selling game to date. With a success story like this, it's only natural for a sequel to be developed and published a year later, which in this case came to be known as Phantasmagoria: A Puzzle of Flesh. One question that may pop up though is, did the sequel tone it down on the graphic imagery? Need I say anything? No, of course not. Just like its predecessor, the sequel was more of the same, this time featuring a different setting and story. This game may have been even worse when it came to graphic content revolving around violence and sex, as it had to be heavily censored or outright banned in numerous Oceanic and European countries. I think it's highly unlikely we'll see another entry into this controversial franchise. Much like Front Page Sports Baseball, Ultimate Soccer Manager was a series of football management games released from 1995 to 1998. To give a sense of realism to the experience, the game took place in an office space where players would interact with objects in a way that mimicked what you would do if you really were in a managerial position of a football team. Despite the series never getting another entry following Ultimate Soccer Manager 98, a small group of fans would look to update the players and teams based on the data from the 2012 to 2013 season. This was done multiple times with each new season as a means of keeping the game up to date. I'm unaware if this is still happening, but regardless, this too will have to slot into the dead tier, as a new game hasn't been released for decades now. By this point, Sierra Entertainment had developed a game for essentially every genre in the market. And before you start wondering, well, hold on, they didn't have a 3D pinball game. Yes they did. 3D Ultra Pinball, as the name suggests, was a series of pinball games, but referring to them as such would feel like a disservice. These games in particular mix things up by including multiple pinball tables on the same playing field, while also having unique animations and additional targets that would pop in and out of play. Each entry in the franchise would switch up the theme, going from a horror set in Creep Night to a Jurassic era theme in The Lost Continent. The series would end in 2000 with the release of 3D Ultra Pinball Thrill Ride, meaning we can place it among the other dead franchises. Following the monumental success of Doom, ID Software looked to develop a successor that expanded upon the limiting factors present during Doom's development. The resulting product would come to be known as Quake, and while the game was popular in its own right, its legacy would have a far bigger impact than anyone at the time could imagine. At its core, Quake was a first-person shooter, in the same vein as Doom, with players blasting their way through grotesque monsters as they explored each levels in hopes of finding secret areas and items. Like Doom, the game featured magnificent and gory explosions that once again gave rise to the notion that violent video games turned players into mass killers. With all of that being said, the main draw point of Quake had nothing to do with its campaign or solo experiences. The biggest innovation added to Quake was the introduction of online-based multiplayer. It was now easier than ever to connect over the internet and jump into some fast-paced, gory action. Quake also offered some absolutely mental movement capabilities, such that people could bunny hop or rocket jump all around the arenas. To the inexperienced like myself, this just made the game total chaos. But to seasoned vets, this added a skill ceiling that was almost infinite. The skill required to perform at such a high level, especially against others who were moving in a similar way, made for a competitive scene that was electrifying. This competitive nature would result in many considering it to be one of the first esports to ever exist, and its draw would result in the franchise expanding to include countless sequels. It also led to an expansive modding scene, the most popular of which actually birthed a whole new franchise in Team Fortress after its popularity exploded in Quake. To this day, the series has seen 5 mainline games with countless spin-offs and most recently a few enhancements of the original games. Quake these days has gone down the free-to-play multiplayer avenue, and as such should most likely sit among the it exists tier. So far we've covered a lot of franchises that were multi-platform in nature. Because of this, it's not too strange to wonder how they would eventually end up in the hands of Microsoft. The same can't be said for this next franchise though, as its origins very clearly root themselves in enemy territory. Now I say this metaphorically as if I was part of Microsoft, as the franchise in question was none other than Crash Bandicoot, one of the oldest mascots of Sony's PlayStation brand. Originally developed by Naughty Dog, the Crash Bandicoot series featured stellar platforming gameplay in which players controlled Crash through numerous cartoonish islands with a myriad of obstacles and enemies to defeat. Each level contained plenty of hidden collectibles and mix-ups with its unique use of crates which added their own sense of challenge when looking to collect everything. This theme was carried into the next 2 games, with the trilogy being widely recognized as one of the strongest trilogies in gaming history. The explosive success experienced by the series would result in further sequels, none of which managed to hit the same peaks as the original trilogy. Amidst this slow downfall, series publisher Vivendi Games would end up merging with Activision in 2008. That same year, Crash Mind Over Mutant would once again release to average review scores. Following this, Crash was sent into a deep sleep as Activision thought of ways to reboot him. Based on the last few games, it was clear to everyone that something needed to change in order to bring Crash back to his glory days. That being said, I doubt anyone imagined just how long it'd take, as the series lay completely dormant for the next 7 years. Coming into 2017 though, the silence was broken with the release of Crash Bandicoot: The Insane Trilogy. These remasters not only updated the game's visuals, but also also added plenty of quality of life changes, like save systems and unified checkpoints. It also added the neat feature of being able to play as Coco, even if she was far worse in most metrics. With sale numbers exceeding 10 million units, it was only a matter of time before the crazy Bandicoot made its triumphant return. And finally, in 2020, for the first time in over a decade, we had a newly original mainline game in Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time. You're damn right it was. Funnily enough, despite all this waiting and praying, Crash Bandicoot still wasn't a Microsoft franchise. In fact, we'd still need to wait another 3 years for it to be considered as such. Throughout 2022, there were rumors going around discussing the possibility of a Crash 5. This would ultimately end up being Crash Team Rumble, a competitive online multiplayer game which released in 2023, in which teams of 4 face off against each other while trying to collect Wumpa Fruit. This marks the most recent release of the franchise, and with Microsoft now in the picture, I'd put money on the franchise remaining fairly consistent going forward. After their initial smash hit in Warcraft, Blizzard looked to tackle another genre. In this case, it was the roguelike dungeon crawlers when they released Diablo. Diablo had all the essentials that are often seen in an addictive game. Procedurally generated dungeons with countless demonic enemies, loot-based RNG that kept you coming back for more, and a leveling system that scratched that power fantasy feeling that everyone craved for. The original Diablo would go on to receive critical acclaim, with many still considering it to be one of the greatest ARPGs in gaming history. Diablo 2 would release a few years later and expand on many of the elements of its predecessor, adding in new classes and even the ability to play multiplayer over LAN. It also introduced the fabled tiering of weapons and armor, which only made the grinding aspect more pronounced. Just like its predecessor, Diablo 2 would be met with very positive reviews, with fans itching for more with each passing year. But strangely, they didn't get anything new. Not for a long time at least, as the series had seemingly entered a dormant state. For over 8 years, fans of the series would have to wait with no news of a new arrival. That dark void was eventually illuminated in 2008, when Diablo 3 was announced at Blizzard's Worldwide Invitational. Diablo 3 would release a few years later in 2012, and its gameplay would end up consuming a good few hundred hours of my life. Personal addiction aside, Diablo 3 had everything and more. It still gripped people with its RNG-based looting system, but also added more classes, PvP, and an auction house. Yeah, it was broken and eventually shut down. The game would quickly become one of the fastest selling PC games in history, and to this day, it has sold more than 30 million copies if you include its expansions. You'd figure that with sales like that, Diablo 4 was right behind it. Yeah, so Diablo 4 took its sweet time. We even got a disgusting cash grab in the form of Diablo Immortal before it. But alas, after another decade of waiting, Diablo 4 would finally be released for 110 Australian dollars. Wait, what? So this game obviously took some inspiration from Immortal. Jokes aside, the franchise seems to be in a decent place at the moment. We've gotten 1.5 games in recent years, and Diablo 4 definitely has been selling well. I'd probably place it among the mainstays for now, as I can see it expanding even more in the future. Now here's a rather obscure franchise. Interstate 76 was a set of vehicular combat games developed by Activision. In a similar vein to Sega's Twisted Metal franchise, the games offered numerous modes, like a story-driven mode as well as your typical deathmatch fights. You were able to customize your vehicles, changing out weapons as well as the more standard parts like the engine and wheels. Interstate 76 would go on to sell decently well, leading to the production and release of its sequel, Interstate 82. The sequel played much like its predecessor, but added a few new additions, like the ability to change vehicles by exiting your current one and entering another. This was only available during the game's campaign mode, but it helped add some much needed diversity to the stages. Unfortunately, the sequel wouldn't receive the same praise as its predecessor. Seeing as it's been over 20 years since this franchise's last entry, I doubt it's going to make a recovery. Now by the end of that same year, Activision was out with yet another game, this time taking the form of an RTS. The game in question was called Dark Reign: The Future of War, and while it was categorized as an RTS, it brought quite a few new ideas to the genre as a whole. The game took on a more sci-fi theme and as such had more creative liberty when designing the two playable civilizations. These two sides were also vastly different, with specific strengths and weaknesses assigned to each one. These differences allowed for a lot of strategic play when looking to outwit your opponent, and combined with the complex mechanics of Fog of War, they led to extremely intense battles. Dark Reign would sell over 685,000 copies, making it one of Activision's most successful releases at that point in time. This would lead to a prequel being developed and released in 2000, titled Dark Reign 2. Despite the sequel bringing the series into the 3D landscape, the game underperformed in its sale, most likely killing off any chances of the series continuing from that point on. There's probably not a franchise out there that has had a more erratic journey than this next one. What started out as a passion project would quickly blossom into an entire series. The franchise would then be picked up by another company, bringing it further into the mainstream, before momentarily ruining it, turning both the franchise and the developers into a laughingstock, only to return to its glory days with a TV show of all things that no one can seem to stop talking about. If you haven't figured it out, I'm talking about the precarious journey of the Fallout franchise. Even during its inception, the team at Interplay wasn't too sure about it, with the sole effort being made by programmer Tim Kaine. Even so, Tim would persevere while convincing others to help out. By the end of 1997, Fallout had officially been released. I'm sure everyone knows the appeal of Fallout. The customization available to you as you create your character offers an almost infinite number of possibilities. Pair that with seemingly endless exploration and combat options, and you've got a game that people could easily sink hundreds of hours into. There were certainly a number of major changes that were implemented once Bethesda took over, the most notable being the game's transition into a first-person's perspective, as well as the change from turn-based combat to real-time combat. Up until the release of Fallout 4 in 2015, the series was regarded as one of the best RPG franchises ever created, and just like they had done with the Elder Scrolls, Fallout was becoming a juggernaut that just couldn't miss. Even the spin-off game, New Vegas, was met with critical acclaim, as it quickly became the favourite of many fans along the way. Then Fallout 76 was released, and well, the franchise was no longer this perfect gem. I'm not going to sit here and drop a nuke on Fallout 76, that's been done to death, and I'm sure anyone who's played it doesn't want to be reminded of that PTSD. That being said, the game did in fact sell incredibly well, and has actually improved quite a lot with the help of the community since. As for the mainline series, we haven't received one in almost a decade. Todd Howard did reveal that the next entry would be released following the Elder Scrolls 6. This most likely means we'll have to wait at least another few years before we even get a chance of seeing it, but I guess we have the TV show to hold us over until then. We've arrived at my personal favourite RTS series, Age of Empires. Initially developed and released in 1997, this series of games introduced a unique setting in which players would advance through the ages based on historical events. You'd start in the Stone Age and work your way through to the Iron Age. The original game would perform well, but it was really the second game that would kickstart the success of the franchise. With more civilizations came more flexibility and variety in matchups. The gameplay had also been refined to a point of near perfection, and the game would go on to receive universal acclaim upon its release. Within 3 months of the game's release, the total units shipped crossed the 2 million mark, cementing the franchise as a new pillar within the RTS ecosystem. Just out of curiosity though, did anyone else call Feudal Age Flamingo Age, or was that just me? Regardless, the franchise continued to pump out games, with Age of Empires 3 releasing soon after in 2005, and also a cool spin-off game in Age of Mythology. Honestly, I may have enjoyed Age of Mythology more than the original, solely because of its mythical themes and use of titans in the expansion. If there's one thing about this franchise that's somewhat egregious though, it'd be the number of remakes, enhancements, or HD collections the series would pump out. I mean, there were years where numerous definitive editions would come out all at once, while the idea of a new mainline entry eluded us. This drought period would last over 15 years, until 2021, when we finally saw the release of Age of Empires 4. At some point I considered this franchise to be long dead. For some context, Age of Empires 3 came out in 2005, so you can imagine my surprise, and I'd assume many others, when we finally did get that elusive sequel. It gives me hope for the future of the franchise, and with over 25 million copies sold, it would be in Microsoft's best interest to keep the series going. That being said, I think for now it only warrants a spot in the It Exists tier. The next franchise on this list is Heavy Gear. These were a series of games based on the tabletop RPG of the same name. See, upon losing the rights to their original mecha series, MechWarrior, Activision made sure to secure the rights to Heavy Gear so that they could continue their experimentation in the mecha-based genre. The game, as a result, played almost exactly like MechWarrior 2, with players controlling mech robots as they ventured through the Wasteland, blowing up roaming cars and other enemy vehicles. The game allowed you to switch between a first and third person's perspective, which was somewhat neat as it helped immerse the player into actually believing they were piloting a mech. The franchise would eventually get a sequel in Heavy Gear 2, which was released a few years later in 1999. The game was a massive improvement over its predecessor, being able to blend in strategic choices with all-out gun blasting action. The sound design also received an upgrade, and there was just something about walking around each environment while listening to the mech's footsteps that was just so enchanting yet calming. This is where the series has been left to this day though, meaning it is unfortunately yet another dead franchise. Following the gargantuan success experienced by Warcraft, it was only a matter of time before Blizzard would get the idea to translate the series into something new, and in 1998, Blizzard would do just that. Blizzard's next franchise went by the name of StarCraft, and despite using the same engine as Warcraft 2, it distinguished itself with not only its themes but also its fresh new additions. For the first time ever, players could choose from 3 different civilizations. While this doesn't sound all that exciting, especially when compared to RTS games of the current era, it was revolutionary for the time, allowing for a large diversity in player matchups. This wasn't any more evident than in the professional leagues that the game had formed. I honestly don't think the term actions per minute, or APM for short, could be better represented than in a pro StarCraft match. I mean, look at this shit. What is even happening? The popularity of this game would only increase over the years, capping out at around 11 million units sold by the end of 2009. With sales like that, it was a matter of when and not if when it came to wondering about a sequel. And in 2010, fans would be blessed with just that. StarCraft 2, much like its predecessor, was met with critical acclaim. The game featured the same 3 species as the original, but had updated many of the unit's abilities. These were oftentimes far more complex in nature, leaving far more strategic opportunities open to the player. Upon its release, the game became the fastest selling RTS game in history, with over 3 million units sold in its first month. This wouldn't lead to another sequel though. In fact, StarCraft 2 essentially became the baseline game going forward. Over the years, the game would receive numerous expansions and even a remaster in 2017. The fact that the game received its own remaster before any news of a StarCraft 3 tells me that Blizzard most likely doesn't feel there's any need to continue pushing the franchise along. I'd say StarCraft is just existing at the moment, which is a weird thing to say when you consider just how legendary these two games are. Following the release of their immensely popular and groundbreaking Donkey Kong Country series, Rare was in the midst of creating a new game for the N64. The project was deemed far too ambitious though, and the production shifted to incorporating 2.5D-esque side-scrolling elements. That was until a certain company slid them the cheat codes, revealing a whole new perspective on the possibilities that could be undertaken with this new game. The game to influence all of this would release in 1996. It was called Super Mario 64. Not only did this game revolutionize how 3D platform games worked with its dynamic camera and analog controls, but it also helped give rise to other great franchises. One of those followed a bear and bird combo as they ventured across multiple worlds while collecting jigsaw pieces and defeating enemies. I'm of course talking about the fabled Banjo Kazooie franchise. Like Super Mario 64, the levels in this game were open-ended, allowing for far more secrets to be hidden inside them. Unlike Mario though, who had core collectibles in the form of stars, Banjo Kazooie were far more free-flowing, with puzzles, bonus games, and other goodies stuffed into each of the visually appealing worlds. The game would go on to receive some much-deserved praise, with many arguing whether or not it could dethrone Super Mario 64 as the king of 3D platformers at the time. With over 3 million units sold in its first month, it was only a matter of time before a sequel would come out. Fast forward 2 years, and Rare had finally put the finishing touches on Banjo-Tooie, a name I still consider to be one of the best as far as sequel titles go. Banjo-Tooie featured more of the same, more challenges, more puzzles, and more light-hearted fun. It too would be met with critical acclaim, and while it didn't sell as well as its predecessor, it still made for a very successful entry into this ever-growing franchise. As we all know though, Microsoft would end up acquiring Rare in 2002, and this pretty much acted as a death sentence for this franchise. At first, the franchise got 2 spin-offs, which were fine, I guess. They definitely didn't live up to the expectations of the franchise, but the most egregious and downright awful edition came in 2008. Imagine waiting years for a true sequel and this is what you get. Like, why are we driving around in cars and building things and yeah, nah, this fucking franchise is dead. We go from one outstanding open-ended platformer to another, but instead of a bear and bird combo, we've ascended to now playing as a mythical purple dragon. That's right, Spyro the Dragon was released barely 3 months after Banjo, and if that wasn't coincidental enough, the gameplay between the two wasn't too different. Now obviously in terms of the general objective, they're both 3D platformers with tons of collectibles to obtain, but their uniqueness derives from their abilities and the fantasy worlds they adventure around in. Just like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro was initially developed as an exclusive for Sony's PlayStation console, and his success garnered him a spot next to Crash as one of Sony's long-loved mascots. The original Spyro had you flying around open-ended levels as you blasted your way through enemies and collected multicolored gemstones. The gameplay might have been simple and arguably too easy, but it was effective, and the thought of playing as a dragon, especially in the 90s, was unbelievable. The original would go on to sell over 5 million copies, giving rise to a whole-ass franchise with countless games flooding the library throughout the early 2000s. By the turn of the new decade, the franchise had essentially been on an annual release schedule, with over 8 mainline games to its name. In a similar manner to Crash Bandicoot though, the series would enter a drought period after being acquired by Activision. This drought period lasted for a whole decade, with many wondering what Activision was cooking. I mean, in terms of Sony mascots, not much. They certainly did cook something else up, but we'll get to that eventually. The silence for the beloved dragon would be broken in 2014, when CEO of Sony Entertainment, Andrew House, mentioned that the team was thinking of bringing Spyro back. This comment lit a fire under the fan, and after an outpour of wishes for the revival of the series, Toys for Bob would deliver on Sony's promise with the release of the Spyro Reignited trilogy. I wonder where they got the idea for this. Yes, just like Crash's revival the year before, Spyro is now back, and looking crispier than ever. The collection would go on to sell over 10 million units, just as Crash's did, demonstrating just how many people still love and cherish these beloved franchises. Psst, wait, that was a hint, Microsoft. Now, just looking at the franchise from a release schedule perspective, it very clearly hasn't gotten the same amount of support as Crash, and as much as I want him to return for now, I can only place him in the it exists tier. As we've already discovered and will continue to discover, Microsoft certainly contains some of the most prestigious gaming franchises to ever exist. With a catalogue as massive as theirs, there are going to be some duds, this next franchise being a perfect example of one. Extreme Paint Brawl was a series of paintball games that base themselves on inattention, distraction, or whatever the hell the opposite of immersion is. Immersion is the kind of word that loves to be thrown around when it comes to media products these days. How well is a game able to create an experience that sucks you in and makes you feel like you're essentially there, in the shoes of the character you're playing as? Well, in Extreme Paint Brawl's case, not very well at all. Bugs and a lack of content aside, the maps on which you played these games didn't even resemble real paintball arenas. This, combined with the terrible AI, a UI that was somehow outdated even back in 1998, and a general sense of the game being unfinished, led to it being reviewed as one of the worst games ever made. Somehow though, this abomination got a sequel, and not just one, but 3, finishing with Extreme Paintball 4 in 2002. Well, if we got this many sequels, surely this meant the franchise turned things around. Nope. From its inception to its death, this franchise was a clusterfuck. It's probably one of the few franchises where no one was sad to see it go. Now here's a franchise I never thought I'd see attached to Microsoft's name. By 1999, Midway Games was an established video game developer that had made a name for itself through franchises such as Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam. The next game would go by the name of Hydro Thunder, and was fittingly part of a series of races known as the Thunder series. Hydro Thunder in particular branched out from your typical car and kart races, focusing more on futuristic powerboats that could soar across the chilly waters or through the decrepit cities. Interestingly, Midway's had plans to create a sequel to this game, but further complications ended in the idea being scrapped. Midway would eventually file for bankruptcy in 2009, with Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment scooping up the majority of their assets. In a strange turn of events though, Microsoft would jump in and purchase the rights to the Hydro Thunder series, and within a year of this taking place, they'd release their very own sequel titled Hydro Thunder Hurricane. Now instead of ruining yet another franchise, Microsoft actually did well with Hydro Thunder Hurricane. For one, the game had kept its core identity in check, with gameplay that was very reminiscent of its predecessor, with updated graphics and a larger variety of boats to choose from. The game also included many hidden shortcuts and boost power-ups, which were core features central to the original series. The additional modes added to single player and the introduction of split-screen multiplayer helped the game garner a positive reception upon its release. With over 300,000 units sold within 2 years, the game had done pretty well for itself and was essentially a modern arcade racer. Even so, I guess it didn't do well enough, as Microsoft hasn't done anything with the series since. It makes it all the more confusing why they jumped in to buy the rights in the first place, but for now, I think it's probably a zombie franchise. In 1991, Sid Meier released a game called Civilization that would go on to revolutionize the genre of turn-based strategy games, more specifically 4X games, where you would explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. This next franchise isn't Civilization, but it did borrow its name when first starting out. Civilization Call to Power was a strategy game developed by Activision in 1999, as a means of capitalizing on the popularity of Sid Meier's Civilization franchise. As you can imagine, the game draws heavy influence from the series, like its turn-based nature and battlefields that are separated using a tile format. Even so, the game offered a few changes of its own, with players now being able to advance further into the future, which added the unique concept of space colonization, and even sea colonization. By the time the sequel was released, Activision no longer had access to the Civilization naming license, and instead had to revert to Call to Power 2. The sequel played a lot like its predecessor, but added a few enhancements of its own. You'd have your general improvements like larger army sizes and a more thorough diplomacy system, but also a few missteps, with players losing out on space colonization as it was removed from the game. A few years after its release, Activision would stop all support for the game completely. Not wanting the game to die out though, fans of the game created a hub site called the Apolitan Civilization site, and after a few months of negotiations, they were able to convince Activision to release the source code for Call to Power 2. With such a dedicated community behind it, the game would benefit from many improvements, with patches and even some mods being thrown in. Officially, I will have to place it in the dead tier or finished tier. It warms my heart though to see that its spirit has been carried on by the community throughout the years. Now for a video about Microsoft franchises, it feels like we're severely lacking in franchises developed by, well, Microsoft. This next franchise though happens to be one of the few that was actually originally published by Microsoft. Midtown Madness was a series of racing games that had players take part in street races as a means of obtaining new cars. The gameplay, while consistent with many of the other races at the time, added in environmental effects as well as plenty of pedestrian and police cars to act as obstacles. The game also featured its fair share of single player modes that either had you zooming around shorter race courses or fighting against their clock. The series would see the release of 2 further sequels, with Midtown Madness 2 and 3. The game also became the basis of inspiration for a separate franchise called Midnight Club Street Racing that featured more open world recreations of the cities they took place in. While that spin-off series would continue on into the future, the same can't be said about Midtown Madness, which unfortunately crashed off course following the release of Midtown Madness 3. Now, as Rare were designing Banjo Kazooie, they had made plans for another game. This one was presented as a 3D platformer and featured an anthropomorphic squirrel. Just like Banjo, this character too would feature in Diddy Kong Racing, and within a year, Rare would release him as the mascot of his own mainline game, called Conker's Pocket Tales. The game had been shifted into an action-adventure game after Rare believed a 3D platformer was too mainstream. Instead, the game played out like a collectathon, with players guiding Conker around large, open environments in hopes of collecting all his birthday presents. The game in this sense was quite a step back from Banjo Kazooie, and even though part of the reason has to do with the limited capabilities of the Game Boy Color, the rest was due to a lack of innovation and boring gameplay. It's honestly astounding that we saw Conker return, but thank God we did, because the next adventure this loud-mouthed squirrel would venture on will go down as one of the best in gaming history. Conker's Bad Fur Day would be released in 2001 for the N64. I always found it funny how Conker originally was designed as a kid-friendly adventure game, but I guess all those negative reviews caused a shift in him, and instead we got an alcoholic, rude-mouthed version of him in Bad Fur Day. This was honestly the best decision Rare could have made, as the witty dialogue, hilarious enemy types, and overall solid gameplay led to this entry being recognized as one of the best platformers at the time. The game was so successful that Rare immediately started working on a direct sequel, known as Conker's Other Bad Day. And if you want to blame anyone for this banger not coming out, blame Microsoft, as after acquiring Rare, they'd tell them flat out that they just weren't interested in the bombastic squirrel. Now, despite saying all that, we did end up getting a remake of Conker's Bad Fur Day with Conker Live and Reloaded, which was released for the Xbox in 2005. Now, it feels weird to call this a remake, as the single-player story is pretty much identical to its predecessor. The multiplayer, on the other hand, is another story, and is the general basis for why this is technically a remake. Even so, it was a relatively simple multiplayer mode, with numerous classes available to choose from. Past this point though, the Conker franchise was seemingly forgotten, and considering Microsoft didn't seem too interested in Conker while it was in its heyday, it doesn't give me too much hope with regards to the future of this franchise. There's probably not another person out there that has achieved what Tony Hawk has, at least when it comes to popularizing a whole sport through the use of video games. As the name suggests, you got to play as the legendary Tony Hawk, as he performed tricks and stunts far too advanced to ever achieve in reality. I guess that's one of the main reasons these games did so well. Not only were the flashing tricks you could pull off visually appealing, but being able to string together so many at such high speeds was exhilarating and made for extremely addictive gameplay. Not only did this bring skateboarding into the limelight, but it also made sure the franchise stuck around, and over the course of the next 20 years, the series would see a total of 20 games released under Tony's name. The series continues to release to this day, with the latest entry Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1+2 releasing back in 2020. That being said, when it comes to the mainline series, we haven't received a game since Pro Skater 5, which was released back in 2015. Taking all of that into account, I can't place this franchise any higher than the It Exists tier, no matter how legendary Tony Hawk is. Here's another rather obscure franchise, at least in comparison to a lot of Microsoft's current ones. In Soldier of Fortune, you take on the role of a US mercenary as you gun your way through a terrorist organization in hopes of stopping a nuclear threat. The game became well known for its graphic depictions of human dismemberment. The game features 26 different gore zones, all of which could be damaged individually, and in turn separated from the core body. It was also one of the few games to implement a method that allowed for a pacifistic run to take place, as you're able to shoot the guns out of enemies' hands, causing them to surrender on the spot. Soldier of Fortune would sell decently well, shipping close to 300,000 units by the end of 2002. This led to the eventual release of 2 further sequels, Soldier of Fortune Double Helix in 2002 and Soldier of Fortune Payback in 2007. These 2 games didn't really add too much to the general gameplay of the franchise, but did improve on the graphics as you'd expect. That's where the franchise has been left to this day, and seeing as there hasn't been any new updates or announcements regarding the franchise since, I'd probably consider it a dead one. The late 90s and early 2000s are where Rare shone the brightest, and this next franchise continues to prove that point. Perfect Dark was a first-person shooter released in the year 2000. Acting as a spiritual successor to the critically acclaimed GoldenEye 007, the game would take much of its inspiration from GoldenEye, mimicking its precise and purposeful movements to a T. The improved engine allowed for more dynamic lighting effects, which only enhanced Perfect Dark. It would go on to receive critical acclaim, being nominated for numerous awards, many of which recognized it as one of the best games that year. Following Rare's acquisition by Microsoft, the series would get its very own prequel in Perfect Dark Zero. This game didn't really expand too much on its predecessor, and was pretty much more of the same generally speaking. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the game wasn't blowing anyone's socks off, that's for sure. Even so, the franchise would continue to breathe with another remaster releasing in 2010. From here, the franchise seemingly went dark though, and for the next 8 years, no new announcements or updates were made with regards to the franchise. This continued until 2018, when a new development studio was founded called The Initiative. This studio would become relevant at the Game Awards 2020, where it was revealed that they were working on a Perfect Dark reboot. The game unfortunately has been delayed for a few years due to the pandemic, but it's still exciting to see that the series isn't completely dead. I can't say for certain whether or not the game will ever come out, but hey, a little hope never hurt anyone, right? The next franchise to come out would be Crimson Skies. This one's interesting, as the concept started as a board game where you'd build your own miniature planes and work your way through your own RPG campaign. 2 years later, the series would make its way into the video game market with the release of Crimson Skies. The original PC game was somewhat of a mix between a typical flight simulator and an action flight game. You could customize your plane, choose your ammunition, and take off into the endless skies while engaging in dogfights against other planes. Series developer John Howard, not that one, stated that the team didn't want to make it a full-blown flight simulator. They were more interested in making a fun game that could fulfill people's desires and dreams. This is why the physics in these games aren't quite realistic, as you're able to do stunts and aerial maneuvers that would be impossible if you were to try them in real life. The franchise would get its very own sequel a few years later in High Road to Revenge. The sequel essentially shot down the simulation part of the original, focusing mainly on the action arcade aspects, as you'd complete the campaign missions by dominating aerial fights. With the addition of Xbox Live, the sequel had the unique property to engage in dogfights against other real players online. Unfortunately, the game must have not sold too well, as there hasn't been any news regarding another entry in this forgotten franchise. This next franchise is a perfect example of things coming full circle. What do I mean by this, you may be asking? Well, for some context, the next franchise to be released would be Project Gotham Racing. No, this isn't a Batman-themed racer, but it is a series of racing games.
Well, no shit.
Originally created as a Dreamcast exclusive by Bizarre Creations, the series would make its way over to Microsoft, with Project Gotham Racing acting as another launch title, this time for the Xbox in November of 2001. Now, despite the game playing like your typical racing game, its core gimmick is what makes it stand out. See, placing first in these races isn't always going to net you the win. Rather, the developers introduced a unique system known as kudos. These were essentially points that you got for completing challenges or racing in a stylish way. To advance to the next stage, you need to not only race well, but also meet the kudos requirement. It's quite an interesting take on the racing format, and definitely one that hadn't been done at that time. The series would perform well, releasing several games up until Project Gotham Racing 4 in 2007. At this point, Bizarre Creations was scooped up by Activision, with Bizarre themselves stating that PGR4 would be the last game produced for Microsoft. Fast forward to now, and well, Activision has been scooped up by Microsoft, completing one of the strangest full circles I've personally seen. Now, I say this as if the franchise has any chance of coming back, which I highly doubt. Activision shut down Bizarre Creations in 2011, so I'd assume this is most likely a dead franchise. Upon witnessing the explosive success of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, Activision looked to cash in on another extreme sport. To do this, they would assign the help of Hall of Famer Matt Hoffman, as they used his name to release their next franchise, fittingly titled Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX. As you can probably guess, this game was essentially a carbon copy of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, but instead of skateboarding, it focused on mixing stunts and tricks on a BMX bike instead. The games would feature a career mode similar to that of Pro Skater, as well as a park editor, which allowed players to make their own little levels. The two games in this franchise ultimately didn't appeal to the players in the same way as Pro Skater did, and after the release of Hoffman's Pro BMX 2, the series was ultimately discontinued. The 2000s also saw the return of simulation-style games, with Zoo Tycoon at the forefront. Instead of simulating a plane, Zoo Tycoon, as I'm sure you can guess, had players building and managing a zoo. With money being the main driving force of the game, you would need to purchase animals and manage their habitats, while allocating staff and resources to not only manage and care for the animals, but also the food vendors and cleaners. The game would prove to be commercially successful, selling over 1 million copies within a year of its release, before ultimately surpassing 3 million units when including its expansion packs. The franchise would see a further 3 releases in Zoo Tycoon 2, a reboot titled Zoo Tycoon, and finally a remaster of that reboot released as Zoo Tycoon Ultimate Animal Collection. This takes us back to 2017, and since then there hasn't been any new entry into the Zoo Tycoon franchise. The series would see a spiritual successor released in 2019 titled Planet Zoo, and while this change signals the possibility of the original Zoo Tycoon being abandoned, Sean Stone, a game designer who had worked on the first two Zoo Tycoons, was able to draw similarities between the ideas and concepts used in Planet Zoo and the scrapped Zoo Tycoon 3. For now though, the Zoo Tycoon franchise seems to be on the back burner, and as such can only slot into life support. Now, as popular as Zoo Tycoon was, I'm sure you'd be hard pressed to find someone who would remember it over this next franchise. Out of the countless companies that developed and produced games, very few had the opportunity to design hardware as a means of playing these games, mainly due to the dominance of PlayStation and Nintendo at the time. Despite this, Microsoft took that gamble, and coming into the new decade they would unveil their very own home console, the Xbox. As impressive as this console looked, it'd all be for naught if there wasn't a particular draw, something that had the power to pull games from their beloved franchises, like Nintendo's Mario or Zelda, or PlayStation's Crash Bandicoot or Tomb Raider. Luckily for Microsoft, barely a year before the consoles were released, they had acquired a studio going by the name of Bungie. At the time, Bungie had been working on a third-person shooter originally planned for Windows. Upon their acquisition though, this particular game would be redesigned into a first-person shooter that would act as an exclusive launch title for the Xbox. As exciting an opportunity as this was, I don't think Bungie knew just how big this game was going to be, or the monumental impact it was going to have on the gaming industry following its release. In November of 2001, Halo Combat Evolved was released with a theme that could only be interpreted as the national anthem for gamers across the world. As a certified Nintendo fan, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't immediately hooked by Halo. While it wasn't the first alien shooter to exist, it did help to modernize the FPS genre with its crisp gameplay, unique weapon variety, and health bar system that had players replenishing their energy shields after a short period of time. Its alien setting allowed for far more creative outlets with unique enemy types in the Covenant and a second set of weaponry in their plasma variants, all of which had unique properties and abilities, making all of them viable in different situations. Despite not being an instant on-the-spot success, Halo would slowly garner a reputation as Microsoft's killer app, with many believing it to be the sole reason the Xbox still exists to this day, with over 6 million units in circulation. It shouldn't surprise anyone to know that the series expanded exponentially. The esteemed Halo 2 would release in 2004, with the original trilogy concluding in 2007 with the iconic Halo 3. From here, the franchise would expand to include offshoots with ODST, prequels in Halo Reach, and even real-time strategy games with Halo Wars. The franchise has quickly become the face of Xbox, being the first thing everyone thinks about when discussing the console. The series was so integral to the Xbox brand that even when Bungie moved on from the franchise following Halo Reach, Microsoft would establish a whole new division called 343 Industries just to handle the Halo franchise going forward. Since then, we have seen the release of Halo 4, Halo 5 Guardians, Halo Wars 2, and most recently, Halo Infinite. The combined sales of the franchise total 81 million copies, with more than 6 billion in franchise gross across games, graphic novels, films, and novels. The Halo franchise, more than any other franchise on this list, deserves its spot atop the flagship tier. Microsoft's next franchise would follow along with Blinx, a cat with the ability to control time. Well, if we're being pedantic, it's his trusty vacuum cleaner that has the power to control time and not really him. Regardless, players take control of Blinx as they venture through numerous platformer levels while sucking up trash, which could be anything from gold to cat medals or time crystals. You can even upgrade your vacuum with the gold pieces you collect, allowing you to vacuum even larger objects. The time control mechanics, while unique, were poorly implemented and added to the difficulty of the game. This difficulty would eventually drop after a few updates, but the game sales had already suffered as a result. Even so, the franchise would get a sequel in the form of Blinx 2, Masters of Time and Space, which was released in 2004. This game retained a lot of the features from its predecessor, but also added co-op play and another group of playable characters in the Tom-Toms. The games were well received, but they definitely weren't popular enough to expand into a fully fledged franchise, especially when they were competing against other up-and-coming franchises like Halo, which had just been released the year before. Blinx is most definitely a dead franchise by this point. Now this next franchise might not even technically be part of this list. We return to the RTS genre with the release of Rise of Nations. This game very obviously took inspiration from the Age of Empires series and acted almost like a spiritual successor to that franchise. As was common for RTS games at the time, Rise of Nations had you advancing through the ages while looking to expand your territory. Unlike many other RTSs though, where you were able to build practically anywhere with flat ground, Rise of Nations only allowed you to build buildings within your own territory. This added a lot of strategy to the gameplay, and while I was terrible at this game in particular, I do remember being able to launch missiles, which I always thought were nukes just based on the devastation that they caused. So okay, they actually are nukes. I guess my dumbass was right. this game would prove to be extremely popular, selling over 700,000 units during its lifetime. So surely it got its very own sequel, right? Well, kind of. See, the game did get another entry with its spin-off titled Rise of Nations, Rise of Legends, which replaced the historical themes of its predecessor with a more fantasy theme, being able to combine both technology and magic in the same world. Outside of that though, the game would retain a lot of the features present in its predecessor. It would add things like heroes and city districts, but for anyone who had played the series, it was quite obvious which franchise this one belonged to. Now technically, because it's a spin-off, the franchise doesn't actually have two mainline games to its name, but in this case, I guess I'll allow it. Either way, it's a dead franchise, so. With the ever-rising popularity of first-person shooters, Activision knew that they needed to get their foot in the market somehow. Games like Doom had initially formed the pathway, while others like Halo had started to polish it. At the end of this pathway was a bounty of treasure. Someone just needed to grab it to acquire the infinite wealth trapped inside. And funnily enough, it would be a company known as Infinity Ward to do just that, when they released a game that would go on to spawn one of the most prolific franchises in gaming history. Call of Duty is one of those franchises that you either love or hate. There's really no in between. Well, unless you're currently addicted to the games, I guess. Call of Duty would touch down in 2003, acting as a Medal of Honor killer, as the developers described it. The game did well to simulate an active battlefield, incorporating effects like shell shock, which would blur your screen and dull your hearing. The original did include multiplayer, but it was very basic, only allowing up to 8 players to play in each match. Its success led to the development of a few sequels, each one performing better than the last, and then Modern Warfare dropped in 2007. Now instead of telling you just how much of an impact this game made, let me just show you straight up from the game itself. Now you may think I'm over-exaggerating, but trust me when I say that before Modern Warfare, Call of Duty was just a fun little military shooter, and after Modern Warfare, it became a global phenomenon. Much of this is due in large part to its groundbreaking additions, like kill streaks to the multiplayer. The gameplay itself wasn't anything innovative, but it was polished to such a high degree that it made you feel like you were fighting a full-on war. The astonishing story being told in the campaign, the crisp and relatively realistic gameplay, as well as the addictive multiplayer, shot Modern Warfare towards universal acclaim, with many kids, such as myself, not being able to get enough of it. From here, the franchise just took off. World at War, while not as elaborate, would tease players with a new concept that would go on to become a fan favourite, mine included, in later installments. Modern Warfare 2 would just completely break multiplayer, with absolutely no balance between some of its weapons, and that's what made it so much fucking fun. And then there was Black Ops, which became, in my opinion, the first game in the series to have the complete trilogy, a decent campaign, very solid multiplayer, and the first real instance of an exceptional zombies experience. Coming into the 2010s, the Call of Duty franchise was about as dominant as it could possibly be. It had already surpassed Halo, and nothing else could possibly compete with it in the first-person shooter genre. I could sit here for hours and just run through each game and the impact it had, but this video is already long enough. The franchise as a whole has sold over 425 million copies, making it the best-selling first-person shooter franchise and one of the most successful in gaming history. Those numbers don't seem to be slowing down either. To no one's surprise, I'm sure, Call of Duty most definitely deserves a spot within the flagship tier. Now, have you ever wanted to play GTA, but from the law enforcement side? No? Yeah, me neither. But the option is there in the form of the True Crime series if you wanted. These were open world adventure games where you took on the role of a detective. What was impressive about these games was just how accurate the recreations of each city were. That being said, the general gameplay loop pretty much mimics GTA to a T. Unfortunately, these games weren't nearly as good as the GTA games, and following the flop of the second game in this series, the franchise would continue to be no more. Oh god, this one takes me back. Geometry Wars was probably one of the best moments I had with the Xbox 360. Interestingly, the franchise started as a hidden Easter egg in Project Gotham Racing 2, but the real fun started when the franchise made its way over to the Xbox 360. These games were pure chaos. Epileptic sieges aside, the goal of the game was pretty simplistic, almost archaic in nature. You go around as this little spaceship that could shoot out lasers to destroy other illuminated shapes in order to reach a new high score. The further you got, the more shapes would surround you, and some of them could even dodge to the side of your attacks. I only ever played the retro evolved entry of this franchise, but I'm glad to see it expanded even further up until Geometry Wars 3, Dimensions Involved, which was released not too long ago in 2016. As for the future of this franchise, who knows honestly. Microsoft may bring it back as a small side game or as a little bonus extra in other games, but in terms of fully fledged mainline games, I can't say I'm too confident. Whatever happened to Fable? That's a question I've heard more times than I'd like to admit. The Fable franchise was a series of action RPGs developed by Lionhead Studios. Released all the way back in 2004, the original Fable was advertised as an experience like no other, with the lead programmers promising a breathtaking world with NPCs who would react to what you did as you aged and received battle scars. With such grand remarks as that, it shouldn't come as a surprise when I tell you that it was an experience that was like all others. Now that's more of a joke on my part, as the game, for what it was, actually turned out to be pretty fun. The main aspect of Fable that differentiated from other ARPGs was a mechanic known as alignment. Players would either be one with the angel or one with the devil, and depending on your actions, you'd either be blessed with a halo above your head or be followed by flies as your eyes turned a glowing red. This added a sense of weight to your decisions and actions, ones that you'd have to take responsibility for later on in the game. Outside of this though, the rest of the game was fairly formulaic. You control your character from a third person's perspective as you completed quests to push the main story forward. You'd fight off monsters, visit and trade in towns, and even level up your attributes as you gain more experience. Very typical RPG stuff, I must say. Now, despite many of the promised aspects never being implemented into the game, it still performed extremely well, selling over 2 million copies as everyone sang its praises. This would result in Fable becoming a fully fledged franchise, with 2 complete sequels releasing in the years to come. Fable 2 would improve immensely on its predecessor, now featuring a fully dynamic world in which to explore. The game was far more interactive, allowing players to make facial expressions during cutscenes. It was also possible to purchase any property that you walked into, with some of them being the only way to access certain quest lines. It felt like Fable 2 was what Lionhead had wished Fable 1 would turn out to be, and as you'd expect, the game was met with critical acclaim, becoming one of the best-selling RPGs on the Xbox 360 with over 3.5 million units sold. Fable 3 would release a few years later, and it was alright, I guess. Honestly, the whole return to the Sanctuary as sort of a hub world really killed the pacing of the game in my opinion, and the gimmicky inventory system inside that place as well just wasn't great. I wasn't really a fan of Fable 3, and it seems like I wasn't alone, as following Fable 3, the franchise would go dormant for a very long time. Sure, there'd be spin-off titles created here and there, but the core series had essentially been dropped off a cliff. Hope arose in 2013 when Lionhead Studios dropped a teaser trailer for a new co-op experience titled Fable Legends. Microsoft would then go and cancel the project while also closing down Lionhead Studios altogether. So I guess that's it then, right? Another dead franchise to add to the list. Or is it? See, during the early parts of 2018, new rumors surfaced stating that a new Fable game was under development by Playground Games. At the time, these were mere speculations, but during Xbox's Games Showcase in 2020, these rumors were proven to be true, as a new Fable title was announced and was said to be in development. 3 years later, in 2023, we would finally see the first in-game trailer for this new Fable, which probably means we're still going to have to wait a while. That being said, with this game nearing its completion, I believe I can move the Fable franchise up into the It Exists tier. We've arrived at the first major franchise to be developed by Double Fine Productions. Psychonauts was originally going to be the premier title for the original Xbox, but following several complications regarding missed milestones, Microsoft would actually end up dropping the publishing rights for the game. The game would eventually release after Double Fine secured another publisher, and it was here that players got to experience the psychic powers of Raz. Raz begins his journey like any other normal person, being able to run and jump. But over the course of the game, he unlocks more of his psychic abilities, like being able to levitate or turn invisible. Players would use these abilities to fight off monsters and work their way through the platforming elements of both the real world and the mental world. The mental worlds added some variety to the game with a different art style and unique level designs. Now, despite the raving reviews for the game, it didn't sell particularly well, resulting in a net loss for Majesco Entertainment, who had published the game. At this point, the future of this franchise was extremely rocky, with many believing it to be a one-hit wonder. After over a decade of silence, Double Fine Productions would take things into their own hands, setting up a Kickstarter campaign in hopes of raising enough money for the development of Psychonauts 2. To their surprise, I'm sure, the Kickstarter turned out to be a massive success, raising close to $4 million for the project. Microsoft would then end up acquiring Double Fine Productions just before the release of Psychonauts 2, becoming its publisher in the process. After 16 years of waiting, the franchise had finally gotten its well-deserved sequel, and this sequel didn't disappoint. The game would become Double Fine's best-selling game to date, and its success leads me to believe that we'll be seeing good old Raz again in the future. Every company needs a landmark racing franchise. Nintendo has Mario Kart, Sony has Gran Turismo, but what about Xbox? Now, for anyone who's ever searched up Xbox exclusives in an attempt to figure out if buying an Xbox is actually worth it, you know exactly which franchise we're talking about here. Alongside Halo and Gears of War, there was a third franchise that many quote and praise as one of the few console exclusives to get excited about. The franchise in question was Forza, which quickly became one of Microsoft's most profitable series to date. As we've mentioned already, the Forza franchise encompasses racing games. While they aren't necessarily as innovative as other races before them, the games were still very good. In a similar sense to the Elder Scrolls, this is one of those franchises that has remained consistently good throughout its lifetime. Forza introduced a damage system to each car that had real effects on the performance of the car, as well as the ability to tune and upgrade certain parts of your car. Each new entry would add something new, whether that be a rewind function that helps less experienced players get used to the controls, or the total number of races in a given race. The series was so popular that a whole sub-branch of games titled Forza Horizon would be developed alongside the main motorsport series. These played a lot more like your typical arcade races, but with a twist. They played out in open world environments in which players could roam around freely while choosing whether or not to participate in certain racing events. By the end of 2016, the franchise had sold over 16 million copies. Given that 5 games have been released since then, I'm guessing this number is far higher nowadays. With a total of 14 games released under the Forza name, it's become one of the most consistent in Microsoft's library, and therefore deserves a spot within the flagship tier. Speaking of landmark titles though, this next one would single-handedly carry a company to stardom. That series was Guitar Hero, the ultimate rhythm-based game that not only helped bring awareness to a lot of underground songs, but also humbled me to the point where I told myself I'd never pick up an actual guitar.
Oh, you suck!
The series was extremely popular during its initial years, selling millions of copies with each game. The idea that you could pick up a game controller shaped like a guitar and play along to some of your favorite songs was simply amazing. Its immense success was how the series would end up on the Activision roster, but almost as if they were cursed, the moment they did acquire the franchise, the popularity of rhythm games as a whole started to tank. Sales were down, and engagement across the games just wasn't there. This was most likely due to the oversaturation of the market. Heck, Guitar Hero themselves released over like 12 games or something in 5 years. They really only have themselves to blame. Even so, Activision wanted to give the franchise one last shot with the release of Guitar Hero Live in 2015. In hopes of bringing excitement back to the franchise, they also released a new guitar controller alongside the game, which featured 6 drum buttons instead of 5. They also released constant updates for the game, adding new limited time songs through premium shows. Now, despite the game garnering praise for its new innovative controller, it didn't necessarily sell that well. This resulted in Activision laying off most of the game's developers before selling the studio to Ubisoft. I think that's a clear sign that this franchise is most likely never coming back. Gun is another one of those franchises that I'm not even sure I should have added, and yes, Gun is the name of the franchise. The game essentially acted as a Western-themed shooter, kind of like Red Dead Redemption, but 5 years earlier. You, as the player, would travel from town to town, fight off bandits, hunt down wildlife, and even engage in some standoffs. This type of game struck a chord with a certain fanbase, and the game performed extremely well, selling over 1.4 million copies in its lifetime. A ported version would release a year later for the PSP, titled Gun Showdown, and it's here where I'm not exactly certain if this counts as a franchise. I mean, it's technically not a new game, it's not a sequel, really it's just a port to another console while using a different name. That being said, it's too late now, it's dead regardless, so I guess it's just in there for extra lore. Now, I'm even less sure when it comes to this franchise on whether or not I should have included it as one. The original Prey game released in 2006 for the Xbox 360. Despite being a first-person shooter, this game had some pretty unique additions to it. For one, there were portals located around each level, which you could then use to travel across large distances. You were also able to shoot through them to hit enemies without them realizing it. I should note that this game came out a year before the groundbreaking Portal, but unlike Portal, the portals in this game remained stagnant. You could also detach the spirit from your character's body. While you only had a limited time in this form, you could use it to fight off enemies or interact with control panels. The game honestly looks really fun, and it performed decently well, selling over 1 million copies within a few months. The success of this first game would lead to the announcement of its sequel, titled Prey 2 at the time. Over the years though, it was becoming more and more obvious that the development on this game was starting to waver. Complications arose once Activision gained the rights to the franchise, and all production on the sequel would seemingly stop. This continued for a few more years until 2016, when Arcane themselves stated that a new game titled Prey would be releasing, not as a sequel, but as a whole series reboot. This means that they'd thrown away all the concept designs for the original sequel, almost like a fuck you if I'm being honest. The reboot would release in 2017, and as they said, it was completely different from the original. It still remained a first-person shooter, but focused more on RPG and stealth-like elements. There were no longer any cool portals to shoot through, and instead you got to explore an expansive open world again. My personal bias aside, the reboot did go on to receive generally positive reviews, but it was noted that its sale figures definitely weren't up to par. That's if it even counts as one, so for now I'd just say it's probably on life support due to its fairly humble sales numbers. Again, as I was recording this, Xbox has just shut down Arcane Austin as well. Remember how we talked about Tango Gameworks before? Yeah, so now Arcane Austin is gone, and they were the ones that were working on Prey. So, you know, it's not looking too good for this franchise either. With Halo dominating the sales chart, it was becoming increasingly obvious that the Xbox was slowly becoming a Halo machine. Microsoft needed another exclusive title, one that would popularize yet another gameplay feature just as Halo had done before, and coming into November of 2006, Microsoft would deliver on just that. For the longest time, I thought the Gears of War franchise were horror games. Now that's mainly because I grew up playing them, but fuck me, were there some scary ass levels in these games. That being said, the first game kind of came out of nowhere. From its story, to the locust enemies, to the focus on cover-based combat, everything about Gears of War just felt so fresh for some reason. It's not like it was groundbreaking or anything, it used Resident Evil 4's over-the-shoulder camera, and its gunplay, while unique in terms of weaponry, wasn't anything complex. The addictive chainsawing definitely made me feel things I'd never felt before. The game also featured 4-on-4 multiplayer, with one team taking the side of the Gears while others got to play as the terrifying Locust. The game would prove to be commercially successful, quickly selling over 3 million units. This warranted success led to the franchise expanding exponentially, with a further 4 sequels being released consistently over the next 2 decades. The series as a whole has sold over 41 million copies, making it one of the most successful franchises in gaming history. As for the future of this franchise, I'm almost 100% certain that Gears of War 6 is already in production. In fact, one of the voice actors, Liam McIntyre, recently dropped a hint on Twitter where he jokingly alluded to a Gears of War announcement in relation to the upcoming Xbox showcase in June. Regardless of whether there's an announcement or not, Gears of War is without a doubt a flagship franchise, sitting right next to Halo and Forza as one of the earliest pillars. Now here's a rather strange franchise that somehow has had numerous games developed for it. Now before you start imagining smacking a pinata, this game, contrary to its name, plays like a farming simulator mixed with Pokemon type collecting elements. It's really hard to explain. You essentially work on a garden to attract pinatas. These pinatas then mate with each other, giving you an egg that hatches you yet another one. There are also evil pinatas that will try and destroy your garden, and the ultimate goal is to collect as many pinatas as possible. The game would perform very well, selling over 500,000 units, which would lead to the production and development of a further 3 games, ending with Viva Pinata Rocket Paradise, which was released back in 2008. During this run, the series would also get its very own animated series, which aired for 2 seasons between 2006 and 2007. With all that being said, the animated TV show would end around the same time as the franchise did, with no new releases being announced or released to this day. Now we've kind of entered the experimental years of Microsoft with these next franchises. Blue Dragon is one of those old, obscure titles that you may have played as a kid and forgotten about once you've gotten older. They were a series of RPG games that incorporated open world exploration with turn-based combat. The general premise revolved around shadows, which were playable characters whose shadows had been modeled after a series of mythical animals. These shadows could then be assigned to a specific class, where they'd gain the specific attributes and strengths of said class. It was quite a unique little game. While it didn't necessarily explode in popularity, it did sell decently well, with over 200,000 units shipped. I guess this gave Microsoft enough confidence to release 2 more games for the franchise. These played similarly to their predecessors, but unfortunately didn't create enough waves to warrant Microsoft's continued support. This too has to lie within the dead tier. The next franchise Microsoft would release went by the name of Crackdown. This was a series of open-world action-adventure games which were essentially just futuristic sandboxes. The focus on the genetically enhanced abilities allowed for far more freedom when it came to upgrading your skill sets and just causing absolute chaos around the open-ended environments. The original Crackdown would receive its fair share of praise, with many citing it as one of the main influences for the rise in superhuman sandbox games that would wash over the 2010s. The Crackdown franchise would see the release of a further 2 games, first with Crackdown 2 in 2010, and more recently with Crackdown 3 in 2019. Wait, 2019? Yes, this series, like many of Xbox's smaller ones, had to survive an awful long time without any water. I mean god, it was delayed like 50 million times or something. Even after being announced in 2015, fans of the series were still forced to wait another 4 years for it. You want to know the worst part though? Crackdown 3, while visually stunning, didn't really improve on any of the features present in the first 2 games. Honestly, it played exactly like them, with hardly any new innovations or changes to the core gameplay loop. The sales figures of this particular game haven't been released, so I'm going to assume they weren't great. Definitely not how this franchise wants to end off. Funnily enough, our very next franchise would almost piggyback off of Crackdown, using its open world format to construct a fresh new narrative. The resulting game came to be known as Prototype. The series has you playing as Alex Mercer, who finds out he has these kind of mutant powers that allow him to shapeshift. He can shapeshift into completely different characters, or he can shapeshift separate parts of his bodies to make for different weapons. I mean, you've got things like Wolverine's claws, you got Nightmare's sword in there somehow. The variety was seemingly endless when it came to Alex's powers. From here, the game would open up completely, allowing the player to just run around, killing and absorbing pretty much anything. The original would sell incredibly well, shipping over 2.1 million copies in its lifetime. This would ultimately lead to a sequel titled Prototype 2, which released a few years later in 2012. The game drew a lot of its elements from its predecessor, but added a few elements like the tendrils, which could be used to throw vehicles as well as dismember enemies. Unfortunately, Prototype 2 never did find an audience that truly appreciated it. Maybe it wasn't what people were looking for at the time, but the game's poor sales ultimately resulted in Activision reducing Radical Entertainment to a supporting developer, with numerous layoff periods being forced. As such, I don't think we'll be seeing a Prototype 3 anytime soon, if ever. From here, we need to take a short detour. Don't worry, it still has to do with Microsoft franchises. Or should I say, sagas. See, when Microsoft obtained Activision Blizzard, they also got a hold of one more company. For the longest time, gaming had been restricted to either consoles or PCs, with very little happening outside of those two mediums. With the creation of smartphones, however, most notably iOS and Androids, this opened up a whole new market for video games. While some people say mobile games aren't real games, it's hard to argue against the numbers, whether that be the number of people playing these games or the amount of money that they bring in. One of the more prominent companies in this field was King, a Swedish game developer who specialized in social games. Social games like Farmville had become a huge drawing point after the popularity exploded on Facebook in the late 2000s. Seeing this, King would dive straight into releasing a few games based on other popular social games like Minor Speed, which was a derivative of PopCap's Bejeweled. This didn't really get them anywhere, forcing them to switch things up. Coming into 2011, King would end up releasing their first saga series with Bubble Witch Saga. Unlike the majority of social games at the time, these saga games had their own individual levels, which challenged players to finish them within a certain number of moves. This freed up time for players as they could now choose to just play through a few levels instead of endlessly grinding or one endless one. The formula would prove to be extremely popular, with Bubble Witch Saga garnering over 10 million players. Now, while Bubble Witch started off this new trend, it would be King's next franchise that truly shot them straight into stardom. We all know this one, your parents know this one, your goddamn dog knows this one, everyone has played this game at least once in their lifetime. If you say you haven't, you're lying. Candy Crush had that same addictive formula that Bejeweled had, but with the new saga format applied to it, this series became unstoppable. I know people to this day who are still addicted to this fucking game. The absolutely insane rise of Candy Crush pretty much elevated King to, well, the position of a king. From here they'd released countless other saga franchises, and while none of them have been as popular as Candy Crush, they've all added towards this titan of a mobile game market. That being said, I don't necessarily want to rank each saga franchise separately. I will instead use Candy Crush to represent the company's games as a whole. That being said, Candy Crush and King are most definitely flagship tier. Now here's a cute little series revolving around costumes. Costume quests were a set of RPG games that had you adventuring around your own little neighborhood while trick or treating. The gimmick here is whatever you were dressed up as is what you would turn into when you engaged in the game's turn-based combat. Pretty neat, honestly. The game also allows you to recruit up to 4 NPCs, which adds a strategic element to the combat as you need to mix in different attacks from each of your costumed heroes. The series would get a sequel in 2014 titled Costume Quest 2, which would add even more costumes to the party. It would also expand on the combat system, adding in new features like counterattacks and double hits. Like its predecessor, the sequel would receive fairly modest reviews, with many considering it a quick fun game to pass the time. That's also where the series has been left to this day. Because it's still fairly recent, I can't say it's completely dead, but it's certainly inching its way closer towards that tier with every passing day. Microsoft at this point looked to pull out all the stops by dipping their toes in any and everything that had potential. And while Nintendo was a clear rival in the ongoing console wars, Microsoft's next big idea was birthed from the very console that was challenging them. The explosive rise of the Wii has often been attributed to one specific factor: its unique and revolutionary take on motion controls, which not only allowed for specific actions to be implemented into the games, but also added a sense of immersion that couldn't be replicated by your standard controls. In an attempt to compete with Nintendo, both Sony and Microsoft would plan out and release their own variation on motion controls. In Microsoft's case, this came to be known as the Kinect. When releasing new hardware though, it's custom to have a launch title to help show it off, and luckily for Microsoft they had just that in Wii Sports, Xbox Edition. Wait, oh shit, I mean Kinect Sports. Obviously I'm poking fun at Microsoft here, but I mean, come on, they didn't even try and hide it. From the naming convention to the me-like clones and even some of the sports. Kinect Sports did separate itself from Wii Sports by having players move their whole bodies for some sports, but honestly it was practically the same thing. Rare would release a sequel the next year which added basketball, golf and skiing, but following an Ultimate Collection bundle in 2012, the franchise swiftly died off. Speaking of Nintendo, years before they had ever had the idea for amiibo figures, Activision had already figured it out with this next franchise. Skylanders had the unique concept of using toy figurines as a means of playing each of their games. Now, it wasn't the first Toys to Life series, but it certainly popularized the format. The series would start off with a familiar face in Spyro, but it wasn't just Spyro. Alongside him were 31 other Skylanders that players could use as playable characters in the 3D action-adventure game. That was the general premise for these games. Collect the physical toys and then use them to play through each of the levels. The games themselves would switch things up with each new entry. Most of the time this entailed introducing a new set of Skylanders, but occasionally the games themselves would get their own new features. These range from being able to switch different halves of each Skylander for different abilities, and even some which introduced vehicles into the fray. The franchise would become one of the most successful endeavors undertaken by Activision. With sales figures in the tens of millions, Skylanders quickly rose to prominence as the dominant Toys to Life franchise. The series would see the release of a further 5 sequels, with spin-off games sprinkled in along the way. Following the release of Imaginators in 2016, the series would enter into a hiatus period, with many speculating as to why we haven't heard about a 7th installment yet. To this day, the franchise has remained dormant, but there may be some hope, as Activision CEO Bobby Kotick would mention that Microsoft had expressed interest in reviving some of the older franchises, Skylanders being one of them. Until we get actual confirmation though, this franchise will remain in the life support tier. Now here's a franchise that had so much potential that seemingly has gone to waste. Rage was the new shiny game ID Software had been working on following the release of Quake 4. The game was marketed as a first-person shooter which took place in a decrepit wasteland with plenty of driving segments that allowed you to explore the world. It seemingly took the landscapes of Mad Max, the RPG elements of Fallout, and the aesthetic and looting system of Borderlands and combined them all into one. The game would go on to receive very positive reviews, with many critics praising the game's graphical style, satisfyingly brutal combat, and the addictive multiplayer components. Now while I say this, I don't believe the game sold anywhere near enough to warrant an immediate sequel, and I say this because it would take another 8 years before one would eventually release in 2019. Rage 2, much like its predecessor, was a first-person shooter taking place in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. This time though, the game featured an expansive open world for players to freely explore, but it was also this very addition that may have just sealed the franchise's fate. See, to have an effective open world, it needs to have things to do inside it. Rage 2 might as well have been advertised as an expansive empty world, as there's far too little to keep players occupied while driving through the harsh deserts of nothingness. It may look aesthetically impressive, but gameplay trumps graphics any day of the week. The game as a result would be hit with very mediocre reviews, and many have speculated that it sold even less than its predecessor. With that being said, I do believe there's a very real possibility that Microsoft just discards the franchise as a whole, but who knows, maybe there's just enough in it to try one more time. There are very few companies that can attribute their success to a single franchise. There are even less who can attribute their success to a single game. But if there was one company to do so, it would be Mojang Studios. And the game to shoot them straight to stardom not only let you mine for materials, but also let you craft them into practically whatever you wanted. Yeah, that was pretty bad. I'm talking about Minecraft. I don't know why I was trying to be cute with it. Out of every game or every franchise on this list, Minecraft is the one I'm sure most of us know about. It went on to receive critical acclaim upon its release, with many defining it as the ultimate sandbox experience where you could create whatever you desired, and with the franchise only getting bigger over time with SMP communities, other spin-off titles and games, and the constant updates that continue to this day. It's no surprise that this game has become the best-selling game in history, with over 300 million copies sold. For some context, that's over 100 million units more than the second best-selling game in GTA 5. I'm sure anyone that's played Minecraft only has good things to say about it, from its endless procedurally generated world to its seemingly limitless variety with regards to its crafting. It's even been used for educational purposes, with teachers building historical landmarks for students to explore and learn about. It's essentially done everything, and the title of Most Important Game of the Decade or Best Video Game of the 21st Century have been passed around from gaming outlet to news outlets constantly in reference to Minecraft. Minecraft is without a doubt a Microsoft flagship, and it may just be the most important transaction they've ever done, or at least it was until the most recent Activision deal. Following up after Minecraft is certainly no easy feat, but Arcane Studios was definitely up to the task with their polished release of Dishonored. I'm sure for anyone that's played Dishonored, there's only positive praise to be said. The game was initially advertised as a stealth-like action-adventure game where you'd sneak around and dispose of enemies in cool and creative ways. And while that certainly was the case, I don't think even Arcane could envision just how spectacular and downright insane people would get with this type of freedom. As much as Dishonored was a polished single-player experience with a strong narrative to follow, it also became somewhat of a montage producer, as every month someone new would come out with a whole new collection of absolutely surreal kills. A lot of this freedom can be attributed to the vast selection of power and abilities the game offers. These can have players teleporting, slowing time, shooting out wind gusts, possessing people, and even summoning a swarm of deadly rats, to name a few. With so many options at your fingertips, Dishonored in some regards felt like its very own sandbox, where you could literally just fuck around and see what crazy shit you could pull off. Dishonored would release to critical acclaim, with many praising it for not only its freedom but also its narrative and its setting. The success would lead to the development of a further 2 sequels, in Dishonored 2 and Dishonored Death of the Outsider. Now while the general gameplay remained fairly similar, each game did look to add something fresh. Dishonored 2 now allowed you to play as either Corvo or Emily, while also improving on the stealth element and overall design of the game world. Dishonored 2 wouldn't sell as well as its predecessor but would still be lauded by critics as a solid game upon its release. The narrative following Corvus and Emily would end with the series' 3rd installment, and it was probably the weakest of the trilogy. This isn't to say it was bad by any means, as Dishonored as a franchise has been solid from start to finish. It tried to reformat a few ideas from its predecessor, but ultimately just felt emptier with less to do than the original game. Even so, the game was met with positive reviews, and many considered it to be an adequate ending to the narrative being told. Now there has been some confusion with regards to the series' future. In 2018, Arcane director Dinga Bakaba stated that with the original story completed, the series was going to rest for now. This got a lot of fans worried, with many assuming that the statement meant that the series was done for good. This would be cleared up a few years later, when Bakaba would reiterate that just because a certain storyline was completed doesn't mean that new games couldn't be developed in the Dishonored universe. This actually would be proven in fact, as a year later Arcane would release Deathloop, a first-person shooter that focused on immersion. The main point though was that this game took place far into the future of the same Dishonored universe. Whether or not you'd count this as part of the same franchise is up to you. I just wanted to point out the possibility of a new game being pretty damn decent in this regard. Now if you ever wanted to test out your zombie apocalypse plan, then look no further than State of Decay. This franchise is a series of action-adventure survival sandbox games where the main goal is simple: survive. Outside of that, you're essentially given free reign to do whatever you want, be that building up massive bases, helping out other survivors, or growing your own food. The game makes a point to teach the player about resource management, because as you'd expect, a post-apocalyptic world that's infested with brain-eating corpses most likely doesn't have too much of that to go around. The original game would go on to receive generally positive reviews, which would ultimately result in a sequel which released 5 years later in 2018. State of Decay 2 looked to introduce cooperative multiplayer in an open world format where players were once again free to do whatever they wished. It was essentially more of the same. And while that may not sound too exciting, it saw a very healthy player base, with Microsoft themselves stating that the game had surpassed 10 million players. 2 years later, during Xbox's 2020 Games Showcase, State of Decay 3 would be announced alongside its very own trailer. It's now 2024 and, well, we still only have the trailer to go off. No new updates, no new announcements, no nothing. Now before you start getting worried that the franchise itself has decayed, just remember that saying, no news is good news. Now if you thought State of Decay was scary, wait until you see this next one. State of Decay isn't scary, man. What am I fucking talking about? The Evil Within would be the next franchise to release under Bethesda's eye. Horror games at this point were oftentimes divided into 2 groups. Those who shifted their gameplay to focus in on the action, and the others who would focus on the survival aspects. And The Evil Within most definitely belongs to the latter, with even more emphasis on survival horror. Much like the earlier RE games, The Evil Within has you fighting off against disfigured monstrosities in very tight spaces with limited ammunition. Some of these enemies are pure bullet sponges, often making players have to run and hide as a means to avoid them altogether. In this regard, The Evil Within hopes to restore some of that fear, that uneasiness with its gameplay. Unfortunately though, its poor pacing, questionably dated design choices and bugs take away from what could have been a truly authentic and memorable horror experience. Even so, the game would prove to be successful, establishing itself as the highest selling new horror IP at the time. The series would see the release of a sequel in 2019 titled The Evil Within 2. The sequel would improve on numerous aspects, mainly through the expansion of its levels, now giving players multiple routes that they could feasibly take to complete the level. A crafting system was also implemented into this iteration, where players can use resources collected in levels to craft items and consumables. As for the future of this series, it's unclear where it stands. Following a leak from Microsoft's Activision Blizzard FTS trial, it was revealed that Tango Gameworks are currently busy developing Ghostwire Tokyo 2, meaning that if there was to be an Evil Within 3, it would still be a fair while away. For now, the franchise most likely sits in the it exists tier. Okay, just a little bit of an update here. When I was writing the script, Tango Gameworks was actually still kicking, but recently they have announced their closure, which means that The Evil Within isn't looking too hot either. By the 2010s, Obsidian Entertainment had become a household name within the RPG bubble, after having created some of the best RPGs in recent years. Coming into 2012, Obsidian would start a Kickstarter for a new game known as Project Eternity. With this project, Obsidian wanted to go back to their old roots and work on a game that was more in line with other classic RPGs like Baldur's Gate. Within a month, they had earned over $4 million in supporting funds, and coming into 2015, the project now known as Pillars of Eternity would finally release. I'm sure if you were a backer at the time, you wouldn't have much to complain about. Like any other RPG, Pillars of Eternity includes the ability to create your very own character, choosing between 11 unique classes. The game adopts an isometric viewpoint and has players build a party as they venture through dungeons while engaging in real-time tactical RPG combat. The visual style was heavily praised, as well as the complex combat style, as the game went on to sell over 700,000 units. Its favourable reviews and solid sales resulted in the franchise getting its very own sequel, with Pillars of Eternity 2, which released 3 years later in 2018. With regards to the future of this franchise, however, it's unclear in which direction it will go. Due to the crowdfunding nature of these two games, director Josh Sawer felt that they were nowhere near as expressive and creative as they could be. He also went on to state that if he ever did make a Pillars of Eternity 3, he'd want to make the combat turn-based instead of real-time. For now though, the team at Obsidian has been working on another game titled Avowed, which was first announced at Xbox Games Showcase in July of 2020. While the story of Avowed will supposedly take place in the same universe as Pillars of Eternity, it isn't technically a part of the same franchise and therefore can't be factored into its placement. I'd assume the future of Pillars of Eternity rides on whether or not Avowed succeeds or not. For now, the franchise can sit in the it exists here. Oh boy, we finally arrived at what I believe is the most recent franchise now owned by Microsoft. We've covered the majority of Blizzard's games by this point, but there is one remaining. One that had so much potential, but has taken one of the worst nosedives possible for a game. I'm talking about Overwatch, a game that was once loved for its interesting characters, its addictive gameplay, and its unique take on the team shooter format. Oh, and the cinematics, like all of Blizzard's, are just spectacular. As someone who's just clocked in over 2,000 hours on this particular franchise, yep, I know, there's something wrong with me, I think I can say with full confidence that this game is on its last legs, with a lot of that being due to the pace in which the game evolved. I know there's countless videos out there stating that Overwatch 2 finally pummeled that last nail into its coffin, but in my opinion the game was dying long before Overwatch 2 ever came out. If anything, Overwatch 2 had the potential to revive and reboot the franchise entirely. And while changing to a 5v5 format and reworking role-specific passive abilities was cool to begin with, the constant errors being made with regards to currency options, level resets, and more recently the ranked system have caused many of its long-time players to slowly drift away. I could probably make a whole ass video on these games given my experiences, but I think it's best if I save you guys from that rant. This video is already long enough. So yes, despite Overwatch 2 releasing in 2022, I'd still say this franchise is falling into the life support tier. Given that the competitive scene is essentially dead, if the game wasn't free to play, I'm sure I'd be placing it even lower. I truly believe that if something isn't done to incentivize new players to play, or to convince old fans to return, I think we could be seeing the end of the Overwatch franchise sooner rather than later. So there you have it, that is the current state of every single Microsoft franchise. Honestly, for the number of franchises they own, I think Microsoft and their army of development studios are doing a pretty solid job when it comes to at least preserving their franchises. Sure, there are plenty of franchises that are seemingly fallen off the face of the earth, but hey, with Microsoft now at the helm, who knows what the future could hold. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It took quite a bit out of me honestly, but I'm glad I finally got it done. If I missed anything or got things wrong, feel free to correct me in the comments below. I hope you guys all have a fantastic day, and I hope to see you all in the next one.